Hello, my name is Matthew Ong, and I am a PhD candidate in Assyriology within the Middle East Languages and Studies Department at UC Berkeley. Although I am currently not actively studying modern Hebrew, I was doing that for the past 2 years, and indeed, I spent the last year doing research in Israel, the occupied West Bank. I've been a member of Doron and Elsa's Piece of Hebrew Club for some time, and I have found their language materials online to be very helpful. I'm making this video because I recently watched a language pedagogy video from the YouTube channel titled Answering Assumptions About Israel. I think there are a number of important points the video needs to be corrected on, and given the severity of the crisis in that region, as well as the fact that I really have no way of reaching a broad audience other than on social media, I've decided to make my video and put it on YouTube. Although the video is in English, I do hope that the Piece of Hebrew Club members or others on YouTube who have watched Doron's video will also watch mine, and I welcome constructive comments and discussion. The video is quite long, but it's divided into sections and timestamps which you can use to navigate between specific points. I'd also like to add that I really appreciate the language content Doron and Elsa produce on their YouTube channel and their club, and I think both are dedicated and effective teachers. I've interacted a little bit with Doron and other members of the Hebrew Club on Zoom occasionally, but otherwise I have not talked with any of them, and I don't know them. I also need to say that I recognize that the video, Answering Assumptions About Israel, is meant to be a listening practice for intermediate Hebrew students, and so the language it uses may be simplified compared to what Doron might say if he were simply speaking his thoughts. I am, however, assuming that what was said reflects his actual point of view. If not, I suggest that you take what I have to say here simply as a critique of the general position taken by the video itself. I also hope that I am not insulting in my video, but I think that aggressive argument is appropriate here. So with that said, let me lay out the general points I'll be talking about. And let me just add here, pretty much for the entire video, I will be reading from my notes or a script, so since I'm looking down like this, that's what I'm doing. There are basically 11 points here. First is a brief explanation of how I lived in the occupied West Bank for a year, came to know the region, both as experienced in the settlement of Ariel and in various tours and private trips of the region. That's the beginning point. The first point is responding to Doron's definition of colonialism and why it inadequately reflects what the critics of Israeli apartheid are saying. The second is an explanation of how moral reasoning works and why many people are coming to bad conclusions about the situation in Gaza. 3 is a discussion of what conditions were like both in the West in general and in British Palestine around the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th centuries, particularly with regard to how territorial states could be formed. The fourth point is just a brief point about what the indigenous or long-time resident Sephardic Jews in British Palestine thought of Zionism. Number 5 is a brief point of the demographic history of the Levant under the British Mandate. Number 6 introduces an argument that I will call the waiting game. This deals with how one should view the basic facts of Israeli military policy from the years before the founding of the state in 1948 up until the present. 7 is a specific discussion of various events around the time of the 1948 war, or Nakba, as Palestinians call it. 8 is a discussion of various points in Israeli history which illustrate the waiting game argument. These historical examples will roughly parallel what Doron discusses in his video. 9 is an application of this waiting game analysis to Gaza in recent decades, as well as the rise of Hamas and Israel and the US's role in encouraging that process, as well as the nature of the blockade. And finally, a remark about what one should keep in mind about the events surrounding October 7th and Israel and the world's response to it. First, let me say that over the last year, ending in about, I guess it'd be about August, I had spent the last year living in the Israeli settlement of Ariel in the occupied West Bank. I had received an academic scholarship from the Israeli government to study with a particular professor of Assyriology there, doing some work, and I essentially lived in the university dorms that entire time. While I was there, I did take classes, I observed to some degree and participated in some amount of the student life, and importantly, I did take quite a number of trips into the rest of the West Bank, often in the capacity as going on, say, a tour, of various places, Palestinian villages, the cities, areas, as part of tours, activist tours, largely political awareness tours, but also traveling a lot myself around all of Israel. I already think I had a basic awareness of Israeli and Palestinian history before I got there, and had a general opinion of the region. But as I lived there, I continued to read more. I observed and thought about events of that year as they played out around me. And since I've returned, I do understandably continue to do that a little bit. And I'll bring up some of these experiences from time to time throughout the rest of the video. The first point I'd like to make here is basically explaining the gist of the term colonialism as it's used by various people who call attention to Israeli apartheid and what they basically mean. And this is just something that I thought up on my own, but I think overall it gets the point across. So this usually includes three things. The first is you've got two groups of people, A and B. B has lived in the area for a long time in a certain area. They consider it their home in the same uncontroversial way that most long-time, even multi-generational residents of America think of that area as their home. And they might even be considered indigenous. The other group, A, consists of much newer arrivals who see themselves as the new owners of the land, often explained as the, quote, original or divinely proclaimed owners or some sort of other justification, who largely do not substantially integrate with Group B in their identifying characteristics, and who ultimately want to displace Group B so that their own society is more like that from which they came. The second point is that sometimes Group A really is a subpart of a larger group, A prime, which might be in an empire, a kingdom, a nation, or a city-state, and most of the people in A prime live far away from Group B, but they still derive material advantages from its relation with Group A, which does live, quote, on the ground near Group B, often to make use of resources, labor, and such. And the third point is that Group A has much more economic or military power, and often more cultural prestige abroad. It uses it to displace Group B, place it in a status of material dependency, or isolate it into subregions of the area, and even killing them if they violently resist. Because both Group A and B are not homogeneous with respect to material wealth or world outlook, richer and more powerful members of Group B often choose to ally with or act as middlemen between Group A and the poor members of Group B. And I see here I've got another point here. There's also the fact that Group A, perhaps as expressed by its leading figures, does this to Group B ultimately as a choice. It is a desire to enact a social vision on a land and the people already settled there, regardless of what that vision might be considered morally, whether that vision might be considered morally justified or not. There is usually a new narrative or interpretation of past history according to which Group A was originally the rightful owners of the land or received a divine mandate to become the owners of the land, or was just sort of naturally more appropriate to be the appropriate owners, or they had no choice but to take over the land. So if you consider these points, it actually does describe many of the societies and historical movements that we would regard as colonial. This includes the Roman Empire's annexation and governance of the Jewish kingdom of Judea, starting in the 1st century CE, the European settlement of the Americas, including Canada, America, Central and South America, Russia's conquest of the Central Asian steppe beyond the Ural Mountains in the early modern period, say the 1700s and afterwards, possibly archaic Uruk in the 4th millennium BC with respect to much of Mesopotamia, Hellenistic expansion into the ancient Near East starting about 300 BCE with Alexander and Seleucids and such, British colonial India, the Republic of China's rule in Western Xinjiang, and modern Israel. I should also point out that when we talk about statehood in the technical modern sense, whether one has it or not, to some degree, that's a social construct. That is to say, it's who decides whether the state has it or not, and whether one recognizes it. But since we're talking about the technical notion of statehood today, I would like to note that although Israel does not recognize Palestine as a nation state, most nations in the United Nations actually do. And that's because of United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3236. It was passed in 1974, and it explicitly recognized Palestinian statehood under the sole authority of the PLO. By 2019, 138 of the 193 member nations of the UN have recognized Palestinian statehood. And by comparison, 163 recognize Israel. The only major opposers of the idea in terms of real political influence are the United States and Israel. I hope that you can see from what I've said that Israel, that is in the historic sense, right, modern Israel, actually is a colonial nation. It is a project of settler colonialism. And I'll go on throughout to make some other historical points to support that idea. But I would like to point out here that Doron marks that Israel does not exploit the local population of Palestinians. That is, after all, seemingly part of what colonialism is about. But this idea is simply false. Israel uncontroversially exploits them in a very simple economic sense. For some time now, the economy of Israel has come to rely on cheap Palestinian labor, much the way that, say, the United States relies on laborers from Mexico and South America. And as a preference among many of its citizens, it depends on cheap Palestinian consumer goods and services. This is much in the way that, again, Americans rely on products or items from Mexico and general immigrant labor for many of the jobs that Americans no longer want to do, or they've forgotten how to do, or they're just maybe because of structural reasons the employers won't let them do that. These Palestinians are paid less than their Israeli equivalents for doing the same work, and importantly, they have no basic rights in that society. They are there at the pleasure of the Israeli state, and they can be arrested and detained indefinitely, killed, searched, have their belongings confiscated, all without serious repercussions for Israel. They have no representation in the society they labor for, and they're effectively controlled by them wherever they live. Thus, one cannot really say that if these Palestinians don't like their working conditions, they can stay at home. The fact remains that they have substantial aspects of their lives controlled by a society that does not give them equitable or even sub-equitable legal rights as Israeli citizens. And yet these laborers are, as I said, essential to the Israeli economy, and thus in a very clear way, they are undeniably being exploited. To hammer this point home, I would like to speak here about the few hours that I spent outside a border crossing facility at Qalqaliya. That's a major crossing point or gate for Palestinian laborers who go over to the Israeli interior in the morning. It's near the border, right, of the West Bank. And so they go there in the morning and they return to the occupied West Bank in the evening. This large-scale facility can be seen in a typical morning where tens of thousands of Palestinians have to stand in a long line and enter a search room, which is by now largely automated. That is, they go in, a voice, whether that's automated or not, I don't know, tells them to put their bags on tables, remove various items of clothing, etc., and the time it takes to go through this area can take hours. While I and my Palestinian guide stood near the search facility, Palestinians would trickle in and out, and I had a chance to ask some of them, albeit via my guide, because my Arabic had been rusty by that point, and it was just better that he talked to them. I got a chance to ask them some questions about who they were, what they were doing there, what they thought of everything there, and I remember two men very well. The first was a house painter who worked as a day laborer. He would typically cross the border early in the morning and wait at certain locations where he could typically pick up work from an Israeli building contractor. He would work a full day, that is about 8 hours, and then return to his home in the occupied West Bank at night. Sometimes a wealthy Palestinian contractor, much like the one who lived in a wealthy mansion in the area, whose house I saw, and who sent his son to Western boarding schools, would have work arranged for him. The man knew well that he was being paid substantially less than what Israelis had to be paid by their own labor laws. What I remember that the man said was that he wished he didn't have to go through all the humiliation of the search room, of having to spend all that time going through the border crossing process at that time, and that he essentially wanted to be treated with dignity. He wanted this system gone. That is, just these very basic, right, features of his life, daily life. The second young person that I talked to that I remembered was a young man who worked as a gym trainer at a private establishment in Tel Aviv. He likely worked mostly with upper or middle class clients. He too knew that he was hired because he was paid substantially less than what an Israeli cost. That man said, if I remember correctly, something along the lines of that his brother had been shot or killed by the IDF or was held in detention, and that he himself had bullet wounds in his arm from the IDF. I believe he also mentioned that the liberal Tel Avivians treated him more nicely than other Israelis. So these are two stories of people who come in and out of the West Bank and go labor in Israeli interior, where basically, I don't know what you could say. I mean, they essentially have really no rights there. And then they go back home. I'd also like to mention one more thing related to border facilities, like the one at Qalqaliya. Some of the Palestinians I saw going through there were there to process some identification documents that were given to them by the Israeli state. It's a sad fact that the first ID that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza receive is given to them by the Israeli state. They get it somehow. We might get a social security number or birth certificate, and they have to register, right? They have to go through these borders and go through a bunch of bureaucracy. It is necessary to have this for crossing the myriad checkpoints set up in the Balkanized West Bank. That is, having an ID, basically. That's always kind of, I would say, a minimum necessity. That ID number is put into Israel's centralized security system, and it will be used to identify them when they are arrested or otherwise tracked by automatic surveillance. It is, in fact, only later that these Palestinians take the Israeli ID. I forgot exactly the time, if it's when they're teenagers or some years after getting the first ID, but they submit it to the Palestinian Authority, in the case of the West Bank, to get their own native ID issued. And yet I will say again, this is a thing imposed on the Palestinians. They have no rights in the society that implements these measures. So that's what I would say about the colonialism issue, at least directly. Now to the second point. I would like to talk here a bit about how moral reasoning works in general from a cognitive standpoint, because I think it will be a useful and succinct way for making certain arguments about what Doron says later in his video. And I should say, I do study the subject at a fairly high level, so I think I do know what I'm talking about. It's a basic fact of cognitive science that humans think in terms of scenes and action programs. The technical term for this is frames. It can be as simple as doing the action of throwing a ball, standing up from a chair, making a speech, doing a full day's work. These are basically stories, actions that have a beginning, middle, end. They've got roles, they've got actions, right? They've got sort of affordances. Some things have positive value, negative value, and such. And indeed, frames have, that's how they're defined. Frames have rules and actions. An example of this is the restaurant frame shown on the screen here. You've got the various roles here that would tell you, like the customer, the cook and such, the actions, paying the bill and such. This is basically kind of a script that humans work by in their brain, and you could, to some degree, program this into a computer. And in particular, frames are important to how we do moral reasoning. The most fundamental frame in moral reasoning is balance, the notion of balance. What is balance? Well, it's illustrated by this image of the balance scale. So you've got, say, two agents, right, actors, or you've got a sort of distribution of materials among people, or maybe that's pretty much all it is, right? Or how we treat people, and basically, if everything is balanced, then the situation is, quote, fair or moral. At the same time, the other important concept involved in moral reasoning is empathy. The fact that we intuitively feel a bit of pain when we see someone else suffering, or perhaps joy when we see them happy. Because we wish to reduce our own suffering, when we think, or when we see or imagine, say, sort of be exposed to someone suffering, we want to help them in part to reduce the pain we feel. Now, this is a very complicated process because it interacts with the balance frame in a kind of a co-generative manner. And in fact, it's quite interesting how that process works. But from a cognitive standpoint, people can have more or less mature and sophisticated capabilities of moral reasoning depending on how extensive their sense of empathy is for others, as well as their ability to facilitate what is called perspectival simulation. That basically means you can evaluate a situation from another perspective, i.e., you can be in someone else's shoes to see things the way another person looks at it. You don't confuse your own way of looking at the situation with the other person's, but you can entertain both in a kind of blended fashion. And we should say what it means to have accurate moral reasoning in this case, right? To do perspectival simulation is to know the relevant facts from that other person's point of view. If you don't understand the person, if you're imagining what they see and feel to be, if that's not actually in accord with what they do think or see, then the reasoning, right, the thinking is faulty. Perspectival simulation is important because it is what constitutes our notion of fairness, i.e., what is right in a moral sense. Fairness at the most basic level means relative to background conditions, i.e., a certain frame, equal people get equal treatment, or they do equal things. That's illustrated by the following image you'll see on the screen. In the first image, person A does 4 hours of work while person B does 8 hours of the same kind of work. In terms of the background conditions, i.e., the frame, person A and B are basically the same. Our moral intuition as mature adults says that B should be paid twice as much as A. Well, how does our theory of morality get us this result? If both person A and B are able to engage in sufficient perspectival simulation, person B will be able to consider things from A's perspective, i.e., that he did have as much work as the other person, and so by mathematical or physical reasoning, that is the sort of basic experience we get as animals in the world, he should agree that he should be paid half as much. And similarly, if person A, taking up the perspective of B, would look and see that he would do twice as much as the work as A, he would agree that he should get paid twice as much as the other person. So it all works out to the same result. Now, from this example, it might sound that this phenomenon of perspectival simulation, at least as a kind of a modeling tool, right, something we consciously use to talk about, that is actually rather trivial. But in fact, as is known from the experience of raising children or dealing with socially immature adults, the ability to engage in perspectival simulation involving ever more complex scenes, i.e. frames, involving greater and more subtle senses of empathy, is in fact what separates the moral monsters in our society from the saints. So really, the more important point is really just average, but ultimately not courageous people who really just go with the flow of what they're told and kind of end up being more of a problem for various decisions that are made in their society. Take, for instance, a little toddler, perhaps 1.5 years old. That child, cognitively speaking, does not have the ability to take up the perspective of another human in the way a 12-year-old does. He really cannot do the kind of perspectival simulation. It's hard for him. He cannot understand what lying is about, or that what another person would see, what they really mean if they lie to someone else, but then they should know what the situation is really about. this 1.5-year-old child essentially only thinks about himself and what he wants as far as many moral reasoning scenarios in life. If he finds himself in a situation, say, where he has to work together with another child to, say, get a bunch of candy, upon completing the work, he will just try to get all the candy and not give any to the other child. He won't think about how both of them contribute equally to the task and so should share the reward equally. And by the way, say a 12-year-old, if two 12-year-olds kind of do this cooperative task, they will basically, unless there's some sort of pathology involved, they will just, let's say instinctively or naturally agree to share the candy. You might see from everything I've said that the frames involved for actual examples of group conflicts are based in complicated back histories, and that this might be difficult for some adults to think about properly. These are examples where the background frame is actually a series of frames with multiple roles, each of which, so to speak, slants the sense of neutrality we want to bring to bear on the frame that it conditions. Now, to give a taste of how I'm going to use these ideas when talking about Doron's video, I'm going to argue that the way many Israelis, due to ignorance and just their cultural upbringing, right, how they've been taught, they essentially see the acts of October 7th within history as something like this. Now, the various events, right, these items sort of detailed in the brackets, we don't need to, pause the video and look at them and such, but the point is really more that you've got a series of frames, right, frames which condition each other, and on the right, morality is seen as a balance scale between two parties. It's just those two parties. And you can see that from the early 20th century on, the Palestinians, in this view, have had, let's say, the heavier negative weights, right? That is, if you're heavier, it means, so to speak, you're doing more bad things, right? Or you've been doing less positive things, so to speak, vis-a-vis the other party, and that continues somewhat drastically, becoming even drastically more unequal on October 7th. But in fact, what I will argue, or rather, so what a great many people living, for many people living outside Israel, with a knowledge of the history of the state of Israel, or who have experiences with occupational rule, or who simply do not see things through the traditional narrative of Israeli history, they would probably think of things like this in the other slide. And again, you can look at the details in those rectangles on your own time, but basically the morality is still, of course, fundamentally about balance, but it's really set up in such a way that after all of the frames, one cannot really simply point to one actor as being unequivocally bad or unequivocally good. If we wouldn't even want to, just to be very, very specific here, say take the actions of Hamas on October 7th, and all this debate about should one condemn them, are they the evil ones and such. Well, really what you have to say is they're bad, but, right, there's a conditioning factor. And you have to take into account all of those background conditioning factors, let's say as far as, meaningful causal relation. And because if you don't, really, you're not understanding the situation, and you're probably going to make the situation worse as far as the amount of harm you cause people. Now, hopefully, as I go through the rest of this video and give my arguments, you'll sort of be able to, just on your own intuition, right, sort of make the various balancing acts on your own, right? I mean, sort of diagramming this would be rather difficult, and I just found it wasn't really useful. So I'm just sort of giving the general idea with that picture of the mobile. Now, I should also say, if we compare those frames again, that in essence, Doron's frame is like the simple frame, which is to say, there's one direction to things, and because that frame is just not accurate to the history of Israel, it shouldn't be used in moral reasoning. Now on to point 3. In the rest of this video, I will be drawing on the work and comments of a number of scholars, most of all, Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky. Really, it's Norman Finkelstein and a number of other people I'll mention as they come up, but Noam Chomsky sort of in the background of things that I'll link to. Norman Finkelstein is an American professor who has spent his professional career researching and writing on the history of modern Israel and Palestine in terms of, quote, the conflict, and is regarded as one of the most qualified experts in his field. He's the son of Holocaust survivors and has for much of his life committed himself to political causes championing meaningful equality and dignity for oppressed groups, and he made the bold move early on in his life to publish his work criticizing certain myths in the reigning American-Israeli narrative about the Palestinians, as well as various individuals abusing the Holocaust narrative for their own financial gain, for which he was ultimately fired from his academic position. He could have simply shut his mouth, as many other cowardly academics and media figures have in the light of heavy pressure from apartheid lobbying groups, but he has instead shown himself to be an eminent speaker of truth to those in power, even if this riles the sensibilities of many who think of themselves as champions of liberal values. Noam Chomsky, perhaps he doesn't need any introduction. He's well known for his insight, objectivity, and phenomenal memory of historical facts relevant for today's discussion. People like this and the scholars I draw on for this video do serious research. If you disagree with their conclusions, I recommend reading through their actual works and sources that they work from before making any claims about inexcusable bias. Try to have a disciplined mind that proceeds from the evidence. I would also like to mention here that if you would like a fairly succinct presentation of Israeli-Palestinian history that is, in my view, quite balanced and not at all argumentative, I would recommend a booklet or a pamphlet published by Green Olive Tours, an organization in Jerusalem which provides tours of many places in the West Bank and Jerusalem with an eye towards educating people about what Palestinian life is like under Israeli apartheid, apart from the very impoverished presentations made of it in mainstream media. I went on many of the tours that are sponsored by Green Olive, and I gained valuable experience from them. Now, having said that, I'd like to go back a bit in history to the decades leading up to 1948 to go over important things people should know about what various people, including Zionist leaders, were thinking at that time, what was regarded as acceptable ways of treating groups of people, how certain political visions could be realized. This is important for establishing the details of those cognitive frames I showed you earlier, right? So the difference between the views that I think the Doron's giving in his video and the one I'll be arguing for. Now, even before that, I'd like to say a word about this word Zionism. Zionism began as a 19th century movement among European Jewish intellectuals, which, at its heart, sought to reconceptualize what it meant to be a Jew, moving from the centuries-old notion of religion, actual belief and associated practices relevant to the worship of a god called Yahweh, from that to an ethnicity, that is, a nation in the older sense of the term. I'm not going to say much about that is, Zionism here explicitly, save to note that much of how I've come to think about both Zionism and Judaism in the medieval period and classical period is based on two scholars. One is Daniel Boyarin, a preeminent scholar of rabbinic Judaism here at UC Berkeley. I haven't taken any classes, I've just read some of his books and talked to him, and an inspiring supporter of Palestinian rights. And the other person is Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, a very, very learned, of course rabbis usually are learned, Orthodox rabbi based in New York, who is a leading figure among anti-Zionist Jews, that is, Jews who really think Zionism is a problem, right? That is, in his words, it's hijacked Judaism. Rabbi Shapiro could be likened to the Noam Chomsky of Zionist history. So I haven't read his books, but I have watched several of his lectures and interviews online. And I should say, it is amazing if you go back to the actual writings of these early Zionist leaders, especially the extreme right-wing ones, and realize how much of what they believed radically departed from the Orthodox, let's maybe just call it even traditional conceptions of what it meant to be a Jew and what Judaism was all about. When Rabbi Shapiro says that Zionism, with its near worship-like focus on land as a defining attribute of Jewish identity, on militarism, on devaluation of the way of peace and dealing with one's enemies and forbearance, when he says that this has hijacked Judaism, I agree with him. As someone who knows some things about the histories of the world religions, especially Christianity, early Christianity, right, of like first century and such, I know basically what he's talking about. And what we see in Israel, in some of its foundational assumptions about assumptions as a modern nation, with its rather arrogant claims to represent all Jews, to be the standard bearer for what Judaism is and what Jews should support, especially in its foreign policy and interpretation of state history, is very perverse and problematic. This is not an essentialist argument. I'm not saying that Israel has to be defined by its past any more than, say, a race essentialist would argue that or just in the ways that say racist essentialist argues that because America had brutal institutionalized slavery, that it's just bad. It'll always be bad, right? It will never get better. That's not what I'm saying. That's sometimes what Israeli apartheid defenders want to think that people like me are saying, but no. But we need to know the facts in order to get to something better. So I'm going to be reading from the works of various scholars, the scholars that I mentioned previously or that I'll introduce as I follow, and sometimes I'll put these quotes on the screen. And here we're looking at sort of the late 19th century, early 20th century situation in British Palestine. So let's just get some sense of what was possible or what people thought was acceptable. We first need to note that the idea of mass expulsion of populations against their will, which is now properly regarded as a war crime and a form of ethnic cleansing, that was accepted by Europeans and Zionists alike, and Americans. So this is from Finkelstein, one of his basic books, Image and Reality in the, I think, the Palestinian Conflict, something like that. Title will be on the screen. He says, French socialists and Europe's Jewish press supported in the mid-1930s the transfer of Jews to Madagascar to solve Poland's, quote, Jewish problem. The main forced transfer between the two world wars was effected between Turkey and Greece. Sanctioned by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 and approved and supervised by the League of Nations, this brutal displacement of more than 1.5 million people eventually came to be seen by much of official Europe as an auspicious precedent. The British called it in the late 1930s, or they cited it in the 1930s, as a model for resolving the conflict in Palestine. The right-wing Zionist leader, Vladimir Jabotinsky, whose name is on a very long, famous street in Tel Aviv that I went on quite often. Taking heart from Nazi demographic experiments in conquered territories, where about 1.5 million Jews and Poles and Jews were expelled and hundreds of thousands of Germans resettled in their place, he exclaimed, "The world has become accustomed to the idea of mass migrations and has almost become fond of them. Hitler, as odious as he is to us, has given this idea a good name in the world." So the point here I'm making is, if you can't already see it, right? If Zionist Jews, if the idea was to basically completely or as much as possible displace, expel the native Palestinians from the land, that's not such a, for the time, that was not such an unheard of, ghastly idea, right? It really, I'm not saying it's morally justifiable, but you could see why these, that this would be in the cards for doing, right? Now, Finkelstein remarks that almost all Zionists wanted to transfer the native population of Palestine in line with typical nationalist movements of the time. Here he says, in the first round of conquest, the Zionist movement set its sights on the, quote, way of transfer. For all the public rhetoric about wanting to, quote, live with the Arabs in conditions of unity and mutual honor, and together with them to turn the common homeland into a flourishing land, being said in the 12th Zionist Congress in 1921, the Zionists from early on were in fact bent on expelling them. Now, of course, it needs to be said, right? The Zionists were only a certain portion, or that is, there's a certain set of people amongst Jews. There were other Jews who actually saw how this was going to be a bad idea, that it was, say it's to be immoral, it goes against basically the most worthwhile, enduring aspects of the Jewish tradition, right? There'd be practical problems and such. So, but we are speaking about the Zionists. So other evidence about this. Tom Segev, an Israeli historian and one of the major biographies of Ben-Gurion, argues that the idea of population transfer was present very early on in Zionism. And this is what he says. The idea of transfer had accompanied the Zionist movement from its very beginnings. Quote, disappearing the Arabs lay at the heart of the Zionist dream, and it was also a necessary condition for its existence. With few exceptions, none of the Zionists disputed the desirability of forced transfer or its morality. The key was to get the timing right. Now, consider also what Finkelstein says about Ben-Gurion at this time in history in the 1930s, when much of the world was seen as up for grabs, right, between the world wars, up for grabs through force and movements of people, where it was still acceptable to refer to non-Western people by derogatory names and such. He says, Ben-Gurion, reflecting on the expulsion option in the 1930s, wrote, "What is inconceivable in normal times is possible in revolutionary times. And if at this time the opportunity is missed and what is possible in such great hours is not carried out, a whole world is lost. So once again, a sense of urgency, but also consciously taking advantage of something. Now, in addition to this, Shabtai Teveth, Ben-Gurion's official biographer, concludes that Israel's first prime minister, Ben-Gurion, intended to expel the native inhabitants as part of the foundation of Israel in 1948. The Zionist vision could not be fulfilled in one fell swoop, especially the transformation of Palestine into a Jewish state. The stage-by-stage approach, dictated by less than favorable circumstances, basically the British rulers, required the formulation of objectives that appeared to be, quote, concessions. It acquiesced in British and United Nations proposals for the partition of Palestine, but only as a stage along a path to greater Zionist implementation. And this is basically saying, as Doron remarks, that the 1947 partition plan was accepted by the Jews. But what he does not say is they weren't happy with that, right? They saw it, they accepted it, but they knew, or they wanted to go beyond that. And that's what they did. Now, I said, the idea of ultimately aiming at territorial expansion through opportunistic responses to immediate political circumstances was not at all unique to Zionist leaders in Palestine. It is what many European powers and, say, Japan did. For their part, American and British leaders thought of the Zionist-led settlement of Palestine like the settling of the American frontier, and the expulsion of the local Arabs was akin to putting down the local Aborigines. And if you don't know, Zionism itself started out among Christians, right? Christian evangelicals who believed that basically bringing about the coming of the Messiah, right? A certain number of Jews needed to be in Jerusalem. There weren't enough of them there. And it's pretty clear that those evangelicals had no idea what kind of Messiah Jesus was. They had their own Messiah. So this is what Finkelstein says. To account for the almost complete disregard of the Arab case by Americans, a prominent British Labour MP, Richard Crossman, explained in the mid-1940s that Zionism, after all, is merely the attempt by the European Jew to build his nation on the soil of Palestine in much the same way as the American settler developed the West. And so the American will give the Jewish settler in Palestine the benefit of the doubt and regard the Arab as the aboriginal who must go down before the march of progress. Contrasting the slovenly Arabs with enterprising Jewish settlers who had, quote, set going revolutionary forces in the Middle East, Crossman himself professed in the name of social progress support for Zionism. So this is a liberal idea, basically, so-called liberal. The left-liberal U.S. presidential candidate in 1948, Henry Wallace, compared the Zionist struggle in Palestine with the, quote, fight the American colonies carried out on in 1776. Just as the British stirred up the Iroquois to fight the colonists, so today they are stirring up the Arabs. So basically, quite an amount of what we would call Orientalism, right? Arrogant assumptions about what constitutes universal fairness and progress when it isn't. Let me summarize this idea by citing from Yosef Gorny, a professor of Zionist history at Tel Aviv University, who argues that Zionism was perfectly willing to use force to realize its ambitions. He says, from the outset, Zionism sought to employ force in order to realize national aspirations. This force consisted primarily of the collective ability to rebuild a national home in Palestine. Now, I should say, Doron's descriptions of the demographic history of this region under the British mandate may lead you to think that there were few long-time Arab communities there, and that most of those that we call the Palestinians were actually recent immigrants, due to the political chaos of the time. This is an argument often made by Israeli apartheid apologists as a way to dismiss claims about the severity of the Nakba or Palestinian claims on the land. It is, in fact, best represented by a book published in 1984 called From Time Immemorial, written by Joan Peters. Peters was an American journalist who covered the Middle East for various American news outlets and who, at least according to Wikipedia, received a phone call from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu close to her death in 2015, thanking her for her contributions to Israel. The only reason I am bringing this book up is to say, on the one hand, that when it came out, it was widely praised in book reviews and by various English and American intellectuals, often liberal-leaning ones, for its scholarship. But Norman Finkelstein went through the book line by line and thoroughly reduced its conclusions to shreds. he showed how, in fact, it was very bad scholarship and how, in fact, the opposite conclusions should be drawn, namely that there was a substantial indigenous Palestinian presence in the British Mandate. And he also incidentally showed how the Israeli apologist and current corporate fascist lackey, Alan Dershowitz, plagiarized substantial portions of the book without attributions or checking their sources. And as we can see from what Dershowitz is doing now, it's in line with what that guy does. So while we might indeed say that there were numerous movements of many people in the region at the start of the 20th century, there was already a substantial, long-time Palestinian population in the British Mandate. Just a quick note here, inserted a little bit after the fact. I'd like to add to what I just said, that after having read a little bit more of Shabtai Teveth's biography of Ben-Gurion, on the one hand, we shouldn't think of what, this idea of basically ultimately expelling the Palestinians or the Arabs, this thinking going on in the 1930s or the 1940s. It's not as if this was somehow like an idea that was just openly known, that it was openly proclaimed amongst, say, all the immigrants and such, or even, say, people who are involved in sort of in the lower ranks of the kind of the leader, you call it the Haganah maybe, or the kind of the leadership, right? What does seem to be true based on Shabtai Teveth's research is that, it was an idea that was kind of implicitly, once you got inducted into the upper ranks, you realize, oh, the real plan is ultimately this, and it's not very concrete necessarily, right? It can be adapted, but the ultimate plan is still to expel the Arabs and to have basically a pure, complete, a pure Jewish supremacist state. And at the same time, it's not as if, say, in the 30s and therefore in the 40s, right, that the immigrants, right, the Jews and the Zionists, right, that they had no reason to fear anything. It is true, by this time, there is a hostility between the two groups. And, the idea that, say, that you might bring in more immigrants, or the idea that you would, put your resources, invest them into sort of military defenses and such, I mean, that's not completely unreasonable. And I do think here that this is where, of course, the bigger backdrop, the shadow of the evil history of anti-Semitism in Europe and the displacement of so many of these Jews, right, as part of nationalist projects, this does become more relevant. But I would like us to just remember at the end, when you look at it, the question is, when you're looking at a historical actor, the question should be, relative to the constraints that we know that they had, did they do the best that they could, morally speaking? Did they try to make the right choice? It's rarely the case that we really don't have some motives, right? Some reasons for doing things that in the end are considered wrong, right? That's going to be a major point of what I say going on. So we shouldn't really be having like very simplistic arguments either way, that say Ben-Gurion didn't care at all about the Arabs from the minute he got there, or that there weren't sort of reasons given the history of that the vicious treatment of European Jews, right? That this idea that having sort of a pure Jewish ethno-state, that would somehow seem crazy. But the fact is that the narrative of Israeli apartheid apologists is, and in general in Israel, is just that this history of Israel has been one of self-defense, right? And there is just an unquestioning assumption that they, quote, deserve to be there, and they've always been wrong since the 30s or something. And evidence shows, no, that is not true. The leadership could have decided to do different things. And even if you think that, say, well, maybe the tensions, right, so to speak, after in 47, that, that there was going to be some sort of mix-up of territory, and we should sort of forgive that, right? I mean, the simple point is that after that, there has been a continuation of that kind of expansionist policy. Here at point 4, I'd like just to make a brief remark about how Sephardic Jews of British Palestine, what they thought about Zionism. And here I'm just sort of speaking extemporaneously. If you actually watch either some of the videos by Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro or read his books, it will become clear that, generally speaking, the Sephardic Jews who had enjoyed long-standing peaceful relations with the Arabs, the Muslim Arabs around them, say in Jerusalem and such, they were at best rather uneasy about the Zionist project. And in fact, they came to oppose it because they saw how it would basically lead to great chaos and violence, disruption in the land, right? In fact, they really did reject some of the decrees from the Zionist leaders, and they just weren't listened to, right? In fact, I also believe that there were other Jews congregations, say, I think in New York, a very famous Jewish congregation at the time, also explicitly opposed Zionism. Just very briefly, I also wanted to just maybe address more clearly this argument that Doron has been making that, well, since there never has been a state in Palestine, one can neither sort of accuse or say that there was an invasion of the land, that there was colonization of the land and such. And on the one hand, well, it should become fairly clear by now that this is kind of a quite a technical, even pedantic kind of argument that really distracts from what the critics of Israeli policy and historians are saying, namely that it's about people and populations, right? I mean, whether it's called a state or not is ultimately kind of besides the point on the one hand. And secondly, again, whether you're a state in part depends on whether somebody recognizes you, right? It's a social notion. And the simple fact is that the United States and Israel have been dedicated to not recognizing that, as we'll get on to say a little bit in the moment. And if one wants to ask, well, why didn't the Palestinians sort of get their act together and try to form a state in a way that would give them more standing legal authority and such, vis-a-vis the predatory acts that Israel visits upon them? And I think here, once again, quite an unfair double standard is being applied. On the one hand, you have to imagine, of course, in the 1700s, in the 1800s, I mean, in Europe, nationalism is just beginning, and it doesn't spread elsewhere. Although there are, you could say, many moral benefits, I guess, to having a citizenry, as Eric Hobsbawm says, right? A nation as an imaginary community of individuals bound together by notions of citizenship and such. I mean, there are definite advantages, right? Just universally positive moral things about having that, as opposed to a kingdom ruled by a king and such. Yes, but that doesn't mean, of course, that if a group of people in some empire, like the Ottoman Empire, have been basically living fine with their notions of who they are, communities, religion, and such, that the fact that they didn't decide to get with the program and form a nation because other European nations were doing so, or that somehow should be held against them. That's really how the Arab population, I guess, of British Palestine tended to see itself, I would say. It is simply a fact that as time goes on, because of the various historical factors that sort of come to bear on the region, essentially, Israel and the United States never really wanted there to be a Palestinian state in the kind of formal social sense. And on the other hand, well, they kind of did have a state in the material sense. On the one hand, or rather, put it this way, right? I mean, when Jordan occupies or administers the West Bank, I mean, why should the villagers say, oh no, we want to become Palestinian and sort of acknowledge that, that we're going to give up our right to return to our homes and we're just going to try and have a state by ourselves, when they've been getting along relatively fine? And even later, of course, one could say that the PLO is effectively the administrative apparatus, right? It is the government. They have elected officials, right? There are services being done. And the fact that, say, Israel, the United States, didn't want to recognize them as the government really shouldn't mean much in terms of the material argument. If you go through the sources, you will see that thoughtful individuals were always there, thinking about how to organize the people on the ground into a more, let's say, more enduring social polity that would withstand the depredations and the violence that was going on around them. When the French, who had such a large swath of the Middle East under their command, And they decided to sort of split it up and play games with the various Arab and Muslim rulers of the time, right? Ending up having Syria and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Well, that kind of boxes these people in. Their sense of identity as Palestinians, in some sense, comes because they were bounded in by these other people, by these people who, these entities that essentially did become nation states. And the one group that probably was in the best position to, in other historical circumstances, say, assimilate those people, right, incorporate them, Israel, or the European Jewish settlers, explicitly did not want to. So it is quite a double standard. I mean, yes, we do have to recognize on the one hand as historical fact, and I guess we surely could call it an admirable one, that there was a strong push for nationalism coming out of Zionism, right, in the 1800s, arguably most strongly spurred on by the vicious anti-Semitic history of European Jews in Europe, right? But the fact that there were other people, the fact that probably most people in the world, certainly not, sort of non-Western ones, right, didn't somehow want to join the bandwagon with what they saw, why should that be somehow held against them? Those people, it is simply true, were trying to form a state when the time was right, and they got shot down for it. For the fifth point, I'll also just show here on the screen statistics about the number of indigenous Arabs, or Palestinians, as we can call them, who were living in the area about the time of the British Mandate, late British Mandate, as well as the number of Jews about this time for comparison. And I am importantly not making a comment about whether or not those people, quote, deserved to be there. But I think it will be relevant to say eventually about whether what the conscious decisions of the leaders of the state of Israel, whether the decisions that they made, whether they were justified in light of the facts. Again, what do the leaders do and what have they got planned? Whether they had choice. So for point 6, I'm going to start out by going to outline the gist of a basic argument I will be making use of for the rest of the video about how the Israeli state, meaning those in charge of the government and military, operate vis-a-vis its Israelis' immediate neighbors and the Palestinians under its control. It's something that I call a, quote, waiting game. This is essentially how I think we should interpret important points in Israeli history up until the present, including the present, in fact, and it is effectively just my own presentation of what other scholars I draw on also argue. The waiting game says that you have tense or hostile relations with other states or groups at your borders or in peripheral areas you have not fully annexed. You have superior military power relative to those groups. You also know that you can trigger a violent response from those groups at the border through a small incendiary action of your own, through baiting enemy leaders psychologically, by committing a cultural outrage that you know, and perhaps the leaders of the other side know, requires some response by force of those opposition leaders in order to maintain their legitimacy as resistance fighters among the local population. In response to the opportunistic baiting, you respond with overwhelming force in the name of self-defense, and you capture territory beyond your borders for security reasons, but you ultimately end up annexing it and extending your country's borders even further. Importantly, the waiting game does not mean that you are actively seeking to drum up conflict all the time. Rather, it is an understanding, perhaps even implicit understanding, among seasoned politicians and generals, that whenever some tension brews at the borders or in the occupied periphery, if you decide to escalate tensions to the point that the other side technically attacks you, you can cross over the border and capture territory which in the short term neutralizes the current attacks, and after which sometime you can decide to keep indefinitely as a security buffer, but which you also ultimately settle with citizens or just regard as your own naturalized territory. So I repeat that the waiting game does not mean that you actively invite reprisals from the people across the border, especially large-scale attacks. So jumping ahead, I think it's kind of clear, or at least I think the evidence is, Israeli politicians and military generals were not, they didn't secretly know about the attacks that would happen on October 7th and then taking advantage of it. But the waiting game says that in general, you can trigger small-scale responses if you wish, or if that an unexpected attack occurs. The side benefit of territorial expansion will always be a prominent principle in deciding how you respond. That's what I call the waiting game. Now, the 7th point is the first of several fairly long ones. The basic point I'm going to make here is that much closer to the 1948 war, there is much clearer evidence that Zionist settlers, and the leaders in particular, were intent on expelling local Arab communities to make the way for their own communities. Uri Ben Eliezer, professor of sociology at the University of Haifa, concludes that the Haganah, which is the early local militia or defense force of Jews under the Mandate, which was the predecessor of the IDF, he concludes that they did clearly use force in this way. It's important to note that the leaders in this group argued that expansive claim of territory beyond borders stated by the UN Partition Resolution was the intended way to proceed in clashes with local and incoming Arabs during 1948. And this is something that Ben Eliezer says. Galilee, who is the chief of the Haganah's National Command, explained the concept to graduates of an officer's course on April 8th, 1948, I think. Asked whether the Jewish forces would fight only in the areas allocated to the Jewish state by the United Nations, and what the fate would be of the dozens of settlements that lay outside of those boundaries, Galilee replied, "We are fighting, and we shall fight for all the territories that have been conquered by Hebrew settlements to this day. The boundaries of our state will be determined by the boundaries of our strength. The political borders will match the borders of the areas that we shall liberate from the enemy, the fruits of our conquests." That same month, after two main Arab forces were beaten at the approaches to Jerusalem and in the Haifa area, a mass exodus of Palestinians was underway from the towns and villages. Some fled out of fear, others were expelled by the Haganah, which was executing a military operation codenamed Plan D. So what's Plan D? Ben Eliezer explains this. Plan D is part of the evidence that the Jewish forces did not only react to Arab violence. The plan called for seizing territory on a countrywide scale, quote, cleansing villages, capturing Arab towns, expelling Arabs from cities of mixed Jewish-Arab populations, and forging territorial continuity between the various Jewish enclaves. As earlier chapters in this book, right, of Eliezer showed, Plan D was preceded by offensively oriented military operations, which held that the fate of the region would be decided by force of arms. That is, the Avner program in 41, Plan B in September 45, Plan May in 46. By late 1947, two staff papers had been formulated which spoke of, quote, cleansing Arab areas, quote, active defense along the borders, and imposing a political solution by military means. Plan Joshua, which preceded Plan D, was also based on the implicit assumption that the whole country was a single territorial unit which must be captured. The multiplicity of plans turned offensive military strategy into a value and contributed to the entrenchment of the political conception, according to which a state would be established by force and not by diplomacy, as the only solution to the, quote, Arab problem was the military one. Plan D may have been couched in language that was vague and generalizing, but the attendant operative orders which went out to the brigades show that the general staff had a political goal, to expand the state's territory beyond the boundaries of the partition plan. In fact, Ben-Gurion, this is me talking, right? Ben-Gurion, in fact, makes it clear that proclaiming borders on the proposed state in 1948 was to be expressly avoided. That's right. Don't fix the borders now, right? Do it after the fighting, with the intent of deciding such borders on other factors like military force. So here is Ben Eliezer. In this, they, that is the general staff of the Haganah, were of one mind with the political leadership. Its view that the state's borders would be determined not by diplomacy but by the strength of the army was voiced in a meeting of the National Administration, the Minchelet Ha'am, that was held on May 21st, 1948. To Pinhas Rosenblitz's remark that it was impossible to avoid the question of demarcating the state's borders, Ben-Gurion replied, "Everything is possible. If we decide here to say nothing about the borders, then we will say nothing. Nothing is a priori." Not conceding the point, Rosenblitz said that a legal question was involved, and Ben-Gurion retorted that people create legal systems. So in other words, he thinks he's above the law, basically. The possibility thus emerged that the military way would determine reality. Ben-Gurion went on to offer an example. If the army were to capture western Galilee or both sides of the road to Jerusalem, and those territories were to become part of the state as a result of their conquest, why should an undertaking about borders be given now? After this, the national administration voted not to introduce the question of borders into the proclamation of the state. So remember, this is after the partition plan, the one that the Zionist leaders said they accepted. Now, Ben Eliezer talks about specific plans to take control of Arab cities and villages in 48. And so this is what he says. In the meantime, Operation Nachshon was followed by a series of offensive thrusts. In all of them, territory was captured. Villages were destroyed and inhabitants fled or were expelled. Major operations were undertaken by Harel to consolidate control in Jerusalem, Hametz to capture Jaffa, Yevusi around Jerusalem, and Yiftach in Upper Galilee. In these and other offenses, dozens of villages and some towns fell to the Jewish force. Plan D only hinted at the mass expulsion of Arabs. And still, the directives to the effect that if a village resisted, the local armed force should be destroyed and the population expelled across the borders were sufficient to actualize assumptions which the young fighters had internalized through the decades of the 1940s. And it should be said, right? I mean, this process of there were riots in the 1930s, right, in which much of the Palestinian leadership, right, the people who would be the natural leaders for the state, right, much like, say, the Jewish settlers, had leaders, right, the people who become the presidents and such, and the military leaders, right. I mean, so on the Palestinian side, that's pretty much cut down because the British army is siding largely with the Jewish population. Now, overall, in 1948, there was a purposeful campaign of harassment, intimidation, and ultimately violence to drive Arab inhabitants out of the way to make room for new settlers. This is what Ben Eliezer says. The flight of the Arabs began at the end of 1947. The Jewish leadership understood immediately that the opportunity which had arisen must be fully exploited. The leadership it used diverse means to encourage and intensify the Arabs' flights. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, harassment by loudspeakers, whispering campaigns to generate an atmosphere of fear and panic. And by the way, I mean, this is sometimes presented, both this fact and what the IDF has done quite often in the past, the fact that they'll sort of announce, they'll sort of tell the villagers, you have a day, right, a week to leave your towns. I mean, the fact, like, that this being presented as a favor, right? I mean, imagine this. Right, you've been living in your village, your home for a long time, and these newcomers, right, with their armed force, or people you've been living with, but really there's no society that enfranchises you together. They come on radio broadcasts, harassment by loudspeakers. I mean, that is not a friendly experience. In fact, I think this following example is quite illustrative, right? So, I mean, one of the reasons the Arabs had to fear these loudspeakers, they're not just empty talk, was that there were massacres committed by the Haganah, for example, in Deir Yassin. This is Ben Eliezer. Arab hysteria had its own reasons. One of them surely stemmed from incidents of soldiers' brutality towards civilians, most notoriously at Deir Yassin. With the approval of the local Haganah commander, David Shaltiel, Irgun and Lehi forces raided the village on April 9th, ignoring the non-aggression agreement which was in effect between the village and the adjacent Jewish neighborhoods in western Jerusalem. The massacre that ensued, in which 250 men, women, and children perished, an altogether extraordinary outcome, even in terms of ethnic conflicts, which can be blood-drenched affairs and produce civilian casualties, spurred the exodus of Arabs throughout the country, right? So it's, I mean, what are you going to expect, right? I mean, people here, right, people who had this non-aggression pact with their neighbors, suddenly soldiers come in and basically kill them. I mean, you leave, like, what is this? I mean, like, to think that they somehow decided, yes, you can take my house because I just decide to go somewhere else. No, I mean, they fled in fear. Other Haganah operations were conducted which saw the mass forced deportation of Arab villagers. And this is even as the political leadership sometimes seemed unaware of what the army ultimately decided to do. So here's Ben Eliezer. So while the political leadership was amazed, the ethno-national army went about its work. At the end of April, the second wave of the Arabs' mass exodus began. Allon, the commander of the Palmach, a sort of crack or elite force, and I should say, Allon, the later originator of the Allon plan for how to Balkanize the West Bank in Israeli interests, in appraising the military situation in eastern Galilee, recommended a series of measures designed to bring about the area's conquest and expulsion of the local Arabs. In Operation Yiftach, led by Allon, dozens of Arab villages were captured and razed to the ground. The large towns of Safed and Beit She'an, which I've been to, right, Skuthopolis, if I'm not wrong, these were also taken. And Arabs who did not flee were expelled. Afterwards, Allon would command other operations in which large number of Arabs were expelled, following Operation Dani, for example, in which some 60,000 Arabs were expelled from Lydda and Ramleh. Allon noted in his report that one of the benefits of, quote, departure, that's Allon's term, was that long lines of refugees clogged the roads and blocked the advance of the Arab Legion. The human tragedy made no impression on Allon. Although he belonged to Mapam, a socialist party, and was a kibbutz member, two institutions which were usually linked with a moral approach. Certainly it paled in comparison with the strategic advantages that accrued from the refugees' flight, or with the vision of the conquest of the whole land, a goal to which Allon and his colleagues had aspired for years. Benny Morris, another Israeli historian, notes that Allon, in all his operations, made a point of not leaving an Arab population in the areas he captured. He had the reputation of wanting to ensure that the rear areas behind his forces, forward lines, would be, quote, Arab clean. And so, note again, Allon goes on to be a parliament member, sort of seen as, quote, liberal in terms of, I suppose, political economy. But once again, I mean, he's basically engaging in ethnic cleansing. I note that the last Haganah operation, before the formal declaration of the State of Israel, explicitly overrode the barriers of the UN partition plan into Galilee and expelled local residents from their homes in a horrific scene that even the Haganah commander carrying out the expulsions saw as tragic. This is what Ben Eliezer says. Operation Ben Ami, the Haganah's last large-scale operation before the establishment of the State of Israel, brought about the conquest of areas in western Galilee which were not earmarked for the Jewish state in the UN partition plan. As far as we know, the Carmel Brigade, which carried out the operation, was not explicitly ordered by either the Haganah or the political level to expel the Arab population. Nevertheless, the brigade's commander, Moshe Carmel, did just that. And readers of the book Carmel published in 1949 about the Operation Galilee will find no boasting about conquests and expulsions. On the contrary, Carmel offers a depressing account of the Arabs heading north. Long lines of refugees, horrific scenes of dying infants, lost women, exhausted old people. Unlike Allon, Carmel saw the human tragedy, but he too did nothing to stem the tide of fleeing refugees, a tide which he himself had generated. And by the way, I mean, this is like, I don't know, like when military leaders say, I specifically did not give the command to kill people and such, and yet it happens under soldiers. I mean, this is an example of how that happens. So how would we summarize the territorial and demographic changes in these explicit acts of territorial expansion? Here I will paraphrase Dr. Norman Finkelstein. After the UN resolution of 1947, giving about 56% of Palestine to Israel and 44% to the Palestinians, and in the 48 war, Israel conquered about 80% of the land, leaving West Bank and Gaza and a bit of Jerusalem. In Gaza, the local indigenous population of 80,000 received about 250,000 refugees from the Nakba, and 70% of Gaza's current population, about 2 million, stems from those people, with about 50% being under 18, that is children, right? So the Gazans essentially, up to this point, were largely refugees, right, when they came there, when they were crowded into that area. Now, this is me. So, I mean, those 250,000 refugees into Gaza were only a portion of those expelled from their homes in what's called the Nakba. So this is something that Doron leaves out of the video. We should not be under the impression that, quote, expulsion is not a minor crime. After all, if we are to be rightly horrified by the fact that European and Turkish powers forcibly expelled 1.5 million Jews from their homes between World War I and World War II, with all the cases of hardship, death, indefinite refugee status, separation from families, indefinite poverty, etc., then we should equally condemn the war crime which Israeli military forces conducted as part of the Nakba or War of 1948, and some people rightly do. As an additional note, I'd like to make a comment here about what Doron says about how the Jews and Palestinians reacted to the UN partition plan of 1947. This is just me speaking. I mean, he essentially argues that the Palestinians made a morally unjustified choice in rejecting the plan because it allocated approximately half of the land to each side. I mean, seems fair, doesn't it? But the problem with this argument, in terms of evaluating the reasonability of historical agents' decisions in the past, is that it is, as we say, presentist. What is presentism? It assumes that the way the world is now, what is regarded as reasonable, what people should think, etc., right, was the same now as then. But this is basically false. On the one hand, no one had a crystal ball in 1947, least of all the Palestinians. No one in this world, in the world of 47, knows that Israel will be a militant state that continues to endure in the region for the next 70 years. No one knows that the US, the world's largest empire in history, will eventually become its unquestioning patron and block much of what the international community understands is a much fairer treatment of the region's conflict. No one knows about the gradually increasing plight and despair of the Palestinian people, the growing brutality of the IDF in the West Bank and Gaza, right? I mean, although you could say, right, I mean, by 1947, the Palestinians, the indigenous Arabs, had already actually they had suffered quite a lot. And the riots, right, but of course, the Jewish population also suffered that, but in terms of the leadership, right, being decimated, and ultimately the preferential treatment of these Jews under the British mandate, etc., right? There was that. So no one knows about the growing plight and despair of the Palestinian people, the growing brutality of the IDF in the West Bank and Gaza. All these people know is that they have been colonial subjects of the British for some time, and who saw large numbers of European Jews immigrating to the area intending to expel them. And then the United Nations proposes a plan in which the Palestinians were not a part of. Although I think it's also true that the Zionists were not officially part of that meeting, where the Western colonial powers have predominant influence on the whole against the Muslim world, Arab world, right? Remember, Muslims and Arabs are not the same thing. So where the Western colonial powers have predominant influence, and on the whole are more partial to the Zionists rather than the Arabs. And so this group proposes that half of the area where they used to live, that is, meaning that large numbers of them will just have to leave the area, will be given to the people who have been largely hostile to them by this point. So the question is, why should the Palestinians have accepted this at the time? Right? The Zionist leaders were not happy with it, but did they accept it? Technically, but as we saw, right, they were intending to take more because really it wouldn't take, you don't have to be very smart to realize that the way things were at that time, there was going to be chaos, right, and territorial grabs. At least for the people who had the power to do it. We can just turn the tables around and ask, why do most Israelis consistently reject both UN Resolution 242, calling for Israel to withdraw its forces from the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai, and relinquish claims to them, and the calls, as well as the calls for a two-state solution along the 67 border? The international consensus is that this is the fair way to treat both Israel and the Palestinians. Can someone who rejects such proposals, right, these objectively fair proposals, really condemn the Palestinians, who were and always have been in lesser positions of power, for rejecting this UN partition plan? I don't think so. I think the people made the rational choice at the time, the morally justified one. So now on point 8, this will also be a long one, time marks. So I would like to go now through some historical examples to show why what I call the waiting game, rather than, quote, pure self-defense, is a better way to interpret some important points in Israeli history, many of which are cited by apartheid apologists for how much moral credit Israel should be given in its treatment of its neighbors and the Palestinians. So first, one should note that the Israeli military was not idle with regards to its neighbors in the first few decades of existence. I mean, nobody's really idle, right? This is how Norman Finkelstein summarizes the hostilities with Egypt in 1955-1956, which included what I call Operation Black, not what I call, what was called Operation Black Arrow. I mention this campaign specifically because it now has a memorial site near Gaza, operated by the Israeli government, in which both beginning IDF soldiers and tourists who participate in government-sponsored tour programs, which they can see. I myself was there, and I saw how Israel invites foreign visitors to view things from their perspective, right? I mean, I read some of these memorials, right? And you can see some photos of that. So this is how Finkelstein summarizes this situation in 55. But in 1955, Israel plotted to bait Egypt into a war that would lead to Nasser, that is the president of Egypt's, overthrow. Israeli soldiers crossed into Gaza and killed 40 Egyptian soldiers. As hostilities increased in October 56, Israel, in collusion with England and France, invaded the Sinai and Gaza, rounded up some 4,000 Egyptian and Palestinian regulars, executed a number of them without trial. On November 3rd, on the day Khan Yunis in Gaza was conquered, hundreds of civilian refugees were massacred by IDF forces. Now, overall, Israeli historian Benny Morris, on the basis of UN investigations at the time, estimates that in the first few weeks of the conflict with Egypt, some 500 civilians were killed by Israeli forces, and that overall Ben-Gurion and Moshe Dayan were plotting to bait Nasser into attacking them through infractions of the armistice. He argues that this was in particular the plan of Moshe Dayan and Ben-Gurion, who could not execute such plans without the excuse of aggression by Egypt, which was, until 1955, largely seeking to avoid confrontation with the IDF. So this is an example of the waiting game. One should note, by the way, that Ariel Sharon was a commander of IDF troops in the area during this time, and he committed a massacre of civilians at Mitla, for which he has never been held accountable. Now, this fact was largely unknown, or maybe ignored, by the public, the Israeli public, until a student of Ilan Pappé, then professor of history at the University of Haifa, did a research project on it. And for this work, the student was severely harassed by the public, and his work was condemned by the university, leading to a severe health crisis, if I remember correctly, or maybe his death, actually, even. But in the end, the work was solid, and the conclusions still stand. I'd also like to note that the idea that the United States has always uncritically supported Israel is actually not true. In fact, already in March of 1957, President Eisenhower pressures Israel to leave Gaza after about 1,000 Gazans are killed. And as I'll say later, it is only with Henry Kissinger, that moral monster of his time, under the Nixon administration, that the U.S. goes from being, let's say, a patron of Israel, but also wanting to position itself as a fair arbiter of world affairs, at least as far as Western colonial attitudes would allow, going from that to basically be just, the executor, right, the protector of Israel under growing criticism from the international community. Now, before I go into my second example, I'd like to say something about the 67 war. I mean, it's a big topic. One can say a lot about it. And I haven't prepared a lot of material on this at all, really. But I will note that in his work on the subject, Norman Finkelstein shows how on the Egyptian border, Israeli military leaders knew that President Nasser and his forces were not a serious threat, and that preemptive strikes, followed by territorial acquisition, were not necessary for Israel's safety. But as everyone agrees that Israel did technically strike first and did take over the Sinai, Finkelstein shows how so Finkelstein also, let me give my own words here, impromptu. Again, you can read Finkelstein's book, right? His historical argument seems reasonable. Read it for yourself, right? But it fits in with the pattern of the waiting game here. And, I was surprised by this. Finkelstein also shows that in the north, in the Golan, Israel was allowing citizens to settle beyond its internationally agreed borders into the Golan Heights, where those illegal colonists were harassing the local Syrian residents. Does this sound a little bit like what's going on in the West Bank? I do. Indeed, once the shooting starts in the region, Israel sends planes to bomb the area, leading to civilian deaths on a scale much larger than those of the colonists. I think it's a repeated pattern here. But back to the second example of the waiting game. What I want to discuss is the situation with respect to Egypt in the 1960s and 70s. And to understand it, we first need to look what happened right after 1967. So, in the wake of 1967, the 67 war that is, the UN Resolution 242 is passed, which calls for Israel to withdraw its forces from the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai and relinquish claims to them. Now, while the political negotiations were headed by Gunnar Jarring, I believe, this guy is actually quite interesting. He's a Swedish Turkologist, very excellent scholar, but he's also the UN Special Envoy to the Mideast, who is appointed by Secretary General U Thant. And he tries to get the US, Israel, and various Arab states in the region to commit to Resolution 242. Up through 1971, the US is fully supportive of Gunnar, and the Arab states were ultimately fairly amenable to it. However, Israel consistently rejected the resolution, even when the UN passed other resolutions praising Egypt for its willingness to accept the peace agreement, but condemning Israel's refusal. right? I mean, the UN, the United States is not rejecting, not blocking that kind of thing at that time. But with the advent of the Nixon administration and Henry Kissinger, the U.S. begins a substantial change in policy towards Israel, as I said, effectively seeing as a client state that it can be used against socialist and Soviet allied Arab countries in the Middle East, such as Iraq, Syria, and later Iran. This is part of what is called the Iron Triangle, and Noam Chomsky talks a lot about it. That is basically what is driving a lot of this, quote, normalization agreements. That's what, say, the Biden administration has on its mind when it's issuing its idiotic and morally disgusting statements about what Israel is doing in Gaza right now, right? This is how, let's say, seasoned politicians, right? People who are career politicians, right? I mean, this is how they think. But so Doron talks about the Camp David Accords. But no, so right, ultimately, the Camp David Accords did lead to an agreement between Egypt and Israel over the Sinai, with Egypt promising normalized relations. But here's something to think about. The terms of the Camp David Accords were largely similar to Gunnar Jarring's efforts to get UN Resolution 242 accepted years ago by Israel. So what changed? Arguably, it was Egyptian military victories in 1967 in the Sinai that began to change Israel's assumptions about what could and could not hold. The IDF simply had a very dismissive attitude towards the Egyptian military. And, to be honest, I mean, this is what the United States Army, again, not every single individual, right? But let's just say as a kind of, traits of many of them, right? As a kind of general character, they said racial, they used these derogatory terms and they didn't think anything about it, right? This is just sort of a convenient nickname. And how would they think if, say, Chinese troops occupy America and they start calling them white dogs or whatever, or white devils or something? So not only did Israeli soldiers call Egyptian soldiers monkeys, 2 months before the October War, Moshe Dayan lectured the Israeli army's general staff that, quote, the weakness of the Arabs arises from factors so deeply rooted that they cannot, in my view, be easily overcome. The moral, technical, and educational backwardsness of their soldiers. So this is Dayan in the 60s, talking about Egyptians. What do you think he thinks about Palestinians? What do you think about the generals now in the IDF, right? The guy who said that Hamas or was it just in general Gazans, they're human animals and such, right? I mean, what do you really think about? Do you think they think they see the humanity in these other people? He's not the only one, right? So going back to 67, Moshe Dayan wasn't the only one who sort of had this attitude of supreme confidence. General Uzi Narkis, IDF, proclaimed that Israel's principal enemy in the 70s is the Soviet Union. The Arabs are merely secondary enemies who harass Israel in the area of relatively minor defense problems. And similarly, Yitzhak Rabin in 73 proudly declared that the Egyptian forces pose no real danger to the armies. However, the Egyptian offense in the Yom Kippur War of October 73 did greatly shock Israeli military and political officials, who were not certain they could continue to hold on to the Sinai. As General Erez Weissman says about the Egyptian army, this is coming out of Finkelstein's book, above all, it had reduced the deterrent capacity of our armed forces. Previously, we could expect the Arabs to think twice before allowing their fingers to curl around the trigger. But in the Yom Kippur War, the Arabs learned that under certain conditions, they were capable of achieving some battlefield gains. And this is Israeli military correspondent Ze'ev Schiff, who concluded that Israel's deterrence capabilities were eroded. He says, clearly the results of the war, he's writing at the time, will contribute to a moral revolution or a morale revolution in the Arab armies. This is the first time in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict that Arab armies have recorded any kind of military achievement. They will obviously be spurred on to additional investment and effort to narrow the quality gap. Despite her victories and growing military power, Israel cannot deter enemies from attacking. The Arabs broke the fear barrier. They weren't victorious, but for the first time, they didn't fail. So, note that in this pre-Camp David period, right, Israel did not want to give up its settlement of Sharm el-Sheikh in the Sinai, right? That's a settlement they set up there for fear of what that precedent would mean for losing illegal settlements in the West Bank. And I think you can see similar logic today. Similarly, for its oil fields and airfields, ultimately, at Camp David, there was no rough arguing for Sharm el-Sheikh, right? I mean, so their attitude completely changed, right? They were, the Israeli administrations was, the dead set on holding that colony, but at Camp David, they changed their mind. And I don't think it's because they just suddenly decided to become saints. Ultimately, Schiff concludes that Israel should cut its losses and accept a political settlement before it loses even more, right? So he's thinking, giving voice to this line of thought, right? That Finkelstein is arguing for. He says, Schiff, in the new conditions, the importance of a political settlement obviously increases. Time isn't on Israel's side, and she must make greater efforts to achieve true peace. And we should add, the Israeli military analysts believed at the time that Syria alone or the PLO alone were not significant threats to Israeli territorial interests. Yitzhak Rabin argued that it was Egypt that had to be neutralized more than anyone else, and the political settlement with them enabled them to stop the Egyptian victories before they did more damage to Israel's ability to frighten its enemies or to enhance the prestige of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, right? In other words, they're basically cutting their losses and trying to avoid getting in a situation where they, could lose, right? Lose their, quote, deterrence capability, which, at some level, sure. I mean, deterrence is, I guess you could say a neutral idea, but what Israel generally wants, the way it uses military power, is the way the Assyrians used their power, right? Updated to the modern world, I'd say. So this is what Finkelstein says. In this same period of conflict, Moshe Dayan remarked to President Carter, if you take off one wheel of a car, it won't drive. Egypt is out of the conflict, there will be no more war, right? This is what Moshe Dayan says. And Carter himself agreed with this analysis. He said, the U.S. analysis once again mirrored Israel's, and he observes in his memoir that it's fairly obvious that the key to any future military threats against Israel was the Egyptians, who could provide the most formidable invading force and who had always been in the forefront of previous battles, right? So Moshe Dayan is basically saying to him, well, look, we need to give these Egyptians something so that we won't look bad, right? We won't might be able to defeat it, and we can handle these other enemies by, once Egypt's out of the way. By the way, this kind of fact, do you learn this kind of fact in general from the news or reading, mainstream media accounts of the wars, in Israeli high schools or whatever? I don't think so. And of course, it's not unique, right? So many facts about American history are not taught in American, public education or private education and university, right? Unless you go into special classes, because that conflicts with what the ruling elites want us to know. So the situation that Doron presents here, as far as the Camp David Accords and such, is really not accurate. Or at least we should not conclude that Israel simply had peace on its mind. Rather, as often happens in international diplomacy with a power that is used to using its superior military force to get what it wants, like the U.S., and which does not consistently hold itself to accountability to others, Israel took a strategic peace-off option because force was no longer viable. And I should also say, so the PLO, right, at this time, right, the predecessor for the PA, for all its corruption, criminality, and incompetence, it did endorse from the 70s onwards a full peace with Israel in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. This is the basic two-state solution, which most nations today regard as the no-brainer resolution for violence involving Israel, but which the U.S. and Israel have consistently rejected. Incidentally, at the 454 mark in his video, Doron mentions that Israel wanted to, quote, give Gaza to Egypt, which had occupied the Strip from 48 to 67, but which never annexed it as part of Egyptian territory. Now, the way this is phrased, it makes Egypt seem cruel and uninterested in what, quote, should be a natural interest of it, which is to say, to take more territory away from Israel, since the two countries are supposedly always fighting over it. But this, once again, is somewhat inaccurate. The first reason is the well-known fact that the militants in Gaza at the time were part of the Muslim Brotherhood, a political faction started in Egypt opposed to the secular military rulers there. the alignment of those militants has always been towards Shiite Iran, right, in the Strip, and Hezbollah, not with Sunni Egypt or secular Egypt, right, the leadership there. So why would this military Egyptian leadership, why would it have been in Egypt's interests, right, the military secular government's interests, to take on the responsibility for a strip of territory controlled by militants hostile to it, right? I mean, this in the time of modern nation states, once you take over, right, you sort of formally annex it, right? I mean, there's all sorts of political liabilities, right? People now want to be able to go to and fro, right? You've got your own internal laws which say you can go to and fro, right? I mean, it's you know, it's a big issue to take on. This just doesn't make sense. Israel knew this. It knew that Gaza would be trouble for Egypt and that Egypt would not be able to effectively control it. Because once again, I mean, the Strip is right up into, you know, Israel, and it's not near Cairo, right? It's across the King's Way, right, as it was called in antiquity. And further, since Gaza was right next to Israel, but further away from the Egyptian center, I would think at the time, right, that Israel thought it could always have reinvaded and retaken Gaza at any time if trouble brewed up. This is another instance of the waiting game that I've been talking about. And so I think the Egyptian leadership, quote, sensibly rejected Gaza, even if today, to people who do not understand the politics of the region, it seems mysterious. Okay, this is just what I thought. And I'd also like to point out, it's not as if Israel and the US were too ignorant, or they didn't see warning signs of what it was doing in this territory expansion, right? The policy, you know, the fact of continually taking more land, it was better labeled land instead of peace. This is what sociologists and other experts of the 1970s warned Israeli leaders about, including one of Israel's star generals of the 67 war, Mattityahu Peled, father of the well-known Miko Peled, who came to see that Israel's occupation of the West Bank was detrimental to the security of Israel instead of being helpful to it. Now, you know, I've known about Miko Peled. I've watched a lot of his videos. I think he's a guy who's got a good reading on things, right? I think he is a very outstanding person of moral courage, right, for standing out against what is sort of just the generic kind of, you know, arrogant assumptions of a lot of Israelis, right? The fear maybe in some to stand up against what, you know, what their peers think and such, right? The fact that it's always easier to stay silent and just not know much. You know, I really respect that. But I didn't know much about Miko's father, and when preparing this, I looked up stuff on Wikipedia, and from that, I do have to say, right, on a personal note, just from looking at this brief biography of him, that the father Peled strikes me as a man who is both well-rooted in what it was like to be an Israeli Jew of the early days of the state, but also someone who is quite open-minded and interested in seeing the humanity of the Arabs around him. He ultimately studied Arabic literature at UCLA for a PhD, and he founded the Tel Aviv Arabic Literature Department. Right? I mean, these are the kinds of people we could have lots of if there were, I mean, as I would say, peace in the Middle East. But what it really means, if Israel if it had, right, from early on, treated the Palestinians with dignity, right? We could have lots of people like this. And it wouldn't be to the detriment of an Israeli state. So when this father Peled tried to argue to Israeli leaders about the folly of the land instead of peace policy that they were following in the West Bank and Gaza, he was effectively ostracized from those circles. And it's most unfortunate that most Israeli politicians and military leaders of that is this generation, have lacked these qualities of Peled's. That has a serious interest in the humanity of the people he has been taught to distrust and even disdain. I mean, again, just go back to that comment by the idea of general saying these people are human animals. And yes, it's true, right? He has a right to be mad, but he shouldn't be a dumbass, right? He should know what the history of Israel is, right? He should really understand how colonial occupations work, right? I mean, the people like this, at least in their public presentation to people, the way that they behave is disgusting. You know, and of course, American generals and such, you know, they're often no different, right? Which doesn't mean that they can't, you know, there's some people in high command, I think, who do seem to be aware of it, and they at least seem to be more reasonable and humane, but that's another issue. So again, nowadays, much but not of all Israeli society, has lost its interest in the humanity of those people, the Palestinians. And I would say that this is largely because of the choices that Israel itself has made. Now on to point 9, I believe. Now, because Doron makes many different claims in relation to Gaza in recent decades, my discussion here will consist more of responses to points of his in the video. But first of all, I think that one has to understand that it has been a general part of Israeli policy since '67 to support or prefer radical Islamic factions in the West Bank or Gaza over their more moderate secular counterparts like the PLO or PA. Remember, the PLO was the Palestinian Liberation Army organization at one point, based in Lebanon, and then so basically Israel invaded Lebanon, and then I think eventually the PLO went to North Africa, right, Tunisia or something, and the IDF did commit massacres basically in Lebanon. I forgot the names of the places, but it's quite a serious issue. Now, it's easy to understand if you follow the logic of domination, rather than the straightforward morality or consistent adherence to liberal values, that this is what Israel would do, right? If you're interested in the logic of domination, rather than consistent application, or your stated desire to promote liberal values, it's easy to convince your own population to support a war and reject a subjugated population's efforts for self-determination when their leaders are extremists who more often espouse violence, even though you yourself also actually use quite a lot of violence. It's hard to defeat a non-violent, secular, anti-colonialist movement because it attracts sympathy in the international community. That's how non-violent protest works, right? It gets the community involved. And in the end, it is simply a more righteous movement. Right, let's say the non-violent or the more secular liberal run, right? It just by the way human experience works. When your audience is Westerners, including Westernized Israelis, however, nothing gets your support more than saying your enemy is a band of religious Islamic terrorists, end quote. Even if, from an objective point of view, the amount of violence that those terrorists or so-called terrorists have committed is much less than yours, and the effective policies they espouse are much the same as what you yourself wish you could realize if only it weren't for the interference, or call it the recording of history, right, from the international community. As I said before, the PLO had consistently endorsed the two-state solution since the 1970s. But once factions like Hamas arose out of the frustration with the inability of secular Palestinian leaders and cadres both to get them out of bondage to Israel, the fact that such leaders could be seen as middlemen cooperating with their colonial occupiers rather than standing up for them, right? That's a classical aspect of colonial occupation, or because the more transcendental beliefs of the religious radicals offered a kind of hope beyond the disappointments of the here and now. Israeli leaders once again saw that they could play a version of the, quote, waiting game. That is, in promoting these radicals, right? You discredit the more dangerous enemy. So that way, right, Israel gets the enemy that they wanted by elevating groups like Hamas, but not too much, of course, right? It's a preferential playing of one group off the other, as colonial rulers know how to do well as weaken the stronger ideological threat to their control. This is pretty much what Bibi Netanyahu did for much of his political career, essentially supporting Hamas against the PA. And there's an article linked to that, right? There's lots of stuff about this. Note that, right, this is true even as he now wants you to let him continue to rule the Knesset so he can eliminate his former client. And one should not really find this kind of strategy unusual, right? It's not as if the leaders of the Knesset, or the tendency to sort of, or the fear that this might be taken as an anti-Semitic trope, I think is really quite naive, right? I mean, what the Zionist leaders did, right? That's part of what this contextualization argument I'm making is meant to show. For instance, like in this day of the Cold War, right? In this time of the Cold War, it was not that unusual for cynically, morally corrupt politicians and military strategists to really be, basically betraying their own democratic values just to basically, extend the power of the empire, right? For example, National Security Advisor Brzezinski, right? This is a famous example. He told President Carter to have the United States aid the Taliban in their fight against Soviet-backed secular factions in Afghanistan, or the Mujahideen. The United States supported Saddam Hussein against Iran in the 1980s, only to turn on him later. So the fact that the Israeli government has done this sort of thing, I don't know, like seemingly to the indifference maybe of a lot of its population, right? This should not be that shocking, even as it is despicable. Now on to some specific points by Doron. At the 6-minute mark, he starts talking about Gaza in 2005, saying that Israel withdrew its settlers from the Strip. What should be noted here is that this doesn't mean that Israel stopped occupying the area, in the sense that international experts on military conflict mean it, or that Israel just had soldiers there to protect its colonists, but otherwise let ordinary life proceed as usual, right? I mean, that's a misnomer about the West Bank, right? In fact, international legal experts, including Israel's own top expert on international law, Yoram Dienstein, argues that Israel's occupation of the Strip has not ended. Putting aside the terminology, or the debate about the terminology for a second, we'll get to some of the practical conclusions these experts are making in a minute. But first, I mean, sometimes, right, again, because of the way the occupation, the infrastructure there works, it's meant to shield Israelis from the consequences of the things that they implicitly or actively support. So Sara Roy is a Harvard political economist and perhaps the only person in Western academia who has done serious economic study of Gaza. She concludes that Israel has consistently sought to impoverish Gaza economically as a whole, even as limited numbers of people could be allowed to succeed. This is basically how neoliberal capitalism works in the United States. In her important book, The Gaza Strip, The Political Economy of De-Development, Roy speaks of the period between 1967 and 2005 as a time of de-development in Gaza, in which the local population was deprived of its most important resources, water, land, and labor. Now, in general, Roy has a much more damning assessment of how Israel has ruled Gaza since 1967. Drawing on many Israeli primary source documents, including the confidential 1986 Gaza Plan, hundreds of interviews, and secondary sources from many Middle Eastern libraries and archives, Roy shows how Israel's control of Gaza has been unusual compared to other forms of colonialist expansion or exploitation, and that for the Zionists, basically just means people who buy into the idea that this land between the river and the sea should be for Jews only, or be a Jewish homeland where, basically other peoples like Arabs are at best second-class citizens. Ideology mattered more than profit in the end. The desire for an exclusivist Jewish state meant expelling indigenous workers was more important than keeping them there eternally in subjugated status. This is effectively the opposite of how the ruling white slave-owning class saw things in the antebellum United States. And, I guess this is interesting, right? I mean, again, like this claim that, well, is Israel exploiting the Palestinians? Well, yes, there's the economic dependency. You can sort of make arguments like, well, in general, if there's a poor country and you sort of link your your economy to theirs, is like kind of helping, right? I mean, aren't the Palestinians get better jobs than those? I mean, to some extent, yes, but ultimately that's kind of a misleading argument because much more is being done, right? Both in terms of political economy and around it to keep that, that version of subjugation. And it's not as if, right, that because other capitalist countries like the United States, right, that they have this relationship with Mexico or the world, right? It's not because that isn't going on alongside of like some conscious apartheid policy that somehow that policy is good, right? There are better ways in general to do things. This is what Roy says. It's a long quote, but it's interesting. She says that Israeli policy in Gaza was not motivated primarily by economic rationality, but by political ideology. This ideology abhorred the notion of Palestinian sovereignty and rejected any process that might encourage it, especially economic development. And consequently, the government in Israel has pursued a policy of de-development in the Gaza Strip, which is predicated on the structural containment of the Palestinian domestic economy and the deliberate and consistent dismemberment of that economy over time. However, although radical structural change of the economy was prohibited, individual prosperity was not, right? So though, basically the economy had to be the way the Israelis said, individual prosperity of individuals in Gaza was allowed. And this is kind of what I said before, right, about the United States. Limited prosperity was meant to mollify Palestinians politically, whereas the loss of their indigenous infrastructure base was meant to ensure their continued dependence on Israel economically and preclude the emergence of any nationalist movement or cultural identity from within the occupied territories. In this way, de-development may be regarded as the economic expression and continuation of Israel's ideological and political priorities. So if this sounds like somewhat overwhelming statement to make, it really is saying something quite simple, right? When you do have this general Zionist kind of, desire to control and expand your state, of course, because the economy is part of that, the way you try to shape the economy will reflect that idea. And then, of course, it feeds back in on itself. And it's basically a fancy way of saying that Israel wanted the land the Gazans were on, but not the people. And this point is very relevant to what Doron says next about how Gaza could have been a Singapore in the Middle East if only the irrational, hateful Gazans had cooperated with the occupying Israelis. By using the analogy of Singapore, I presume that Doron means a commercial center that largely did not depend on agriculture, but rather, quote, human capital. Particularly, although it's true, right? I mean, Gaza's economy before was largely, I think, the citrus economy. And it is interesting, by the way, that if, as I learned when I went to the Gaza border before October, you can see how basically this agricultural zone around the wall is being used for cultivation, right, by Israelis. The workers there are largely, I think, workers from East Asia because it's too much of a, quote, security risk to, have Palestinians there. But that area is being exploited by Israelis, right up to the wall, because it's good agricultural land. But so the point here about Singapore, right, is that it's meant to be about human capital, particularly with regards to finance, and where the upper economic class is heavily constituted by foreigners and internationalized elites, right? That's what the image of Singapore brings up. There are two problems with this claim, right? This idea that Gaza could have been Singapore if only the, irrational Gazans had cooperated. So first is what I just quoted from Sara Roy. The Israelis were not interested in raising up the local population of Palestinians en masse. Their economic policies from 1967 onward are a testament to that. Allowing limited number of people to rise up and become elites was indeed an intermediate strategy, but this is simply what colonial rulers do in order to maintain control of local population. Now, second point, I'd like to point out what is going on in East Jerusalem and the area further east, especially in the area of the West Bank known as E1. This area, perhaps more than anywhere else in the West Bank, has been subject to intense economic pressure by Israel as part of its efforts to effectively drive out local Palestinian landowners and let them be replaced by Israeli settlers. This is an area that is effectively seeing the kind of development that we would expect to find in Gaza under Doron's scenario. But as has been clear for some time, many tools of the segregationist toolkit have been brought to bear on this region. For instance, the dual road system, right, the checkpoints, cutting off people from access to their lands, dividing Palestinian towns in two with major roads that only Israelis can access, developing municipal services for Israeli settlements but not for Palestinian towns, ultimately just bringing in huge financial resources for the state to buy up property for Israeli settlers, while the Palestinians largely have nothing to match this. And as a personal note, I remember quite clearly on my tour to the border of the Gaza Strip, again before October 7th by a wide margin, that my guide, a Palestinian native of East Jerusalem, told us not only of all the legal and administrative difficulties the Israeli state put up to them transferring their houses to their descendants. He also said that this offer of, quote, development had been made to them. I don't know if it means like literally like in a letter, but it was basically made to them generally. To paraphrase him, and here he's talking about, right, he's voicing the Israeli developer, all you have to do is give up your legal right to the land. Then we, the Israelis, right, or the developers, whatever, will come in with our resources and we will build the shopping centers, the parks, the new housing complexes, the buses, the trains, and the schools. But, so me, right, as my guide knew, and I hope that you too, viewers, can see, once you give up your right to the land, keeping in mind you're not a citizen of Israel, right, keep in mind there is basically a territorial expansion, right? That's the project going on here. Once you give up your right to the land, you are simply a transient worker. There are, as far as I know, hardly any anti-discrimination laws in Israel to protect Palestinians in the realm of housing, business, and basically general life, right? If you're Palestinian, I think you can't buy a house or an apartment in Tel Aviv, I think, right? It's just as an effective matter, I think, or, you could expect laws like this to be around in various places. So when you add all this to all the economic incentives the Israeli state offers to Israeli settlers to come and move in, like housing subsidies, for instance, right? The fact that, in fact, the fact that when, say, refugee Jewish immigrants, right, when they come, say, from Russia, Ukraine, that some of these people are placed in the illegal colonies of the West Bank, where they kind of know, as a fact, right, that's where they'll kind of set up roots, because it's hard for those people to go elsewhere, right, to find jobs maybe in the beginning because they don't know the language and such, right, or that they have a community of other immigrants there, right? They use those people to kind of grow the colonies. Even those people may not want to support that project. But to get back to this, right, when you add all that giving up the right to the land with all the economic incentives that the Israeli state offers to the settlers to come and move, you can see how the, quote, private market would either drive those former Palestinian land and house owners away from the area, or tolerate them only in low-class jobs, much as we see in other illegal colonies of the West Bank, right? I saw those people, right? If you're, I mean, in the West Bank, those are citadels, right? There are guards there. If you're a Palestinian, you got to prove that you're worthy of coming in. And yeah, you get to be maybe a shop owner, you get to, sweep or something. I mean, there's a variety of things they do. And in the super illegal settlements, right, twice over, you're often building the facilities of the people who, hate your guts and want to kick you out. I could summarize all of this that I just said by saying that even if Israel truly did want to build a Singapore in Gaza, and, ultimately if all the Gazans were gone, it ultimately wouldn't be for the Gazans on the whole. Zionist state policies, general anti-Palestinian sentiment, and the cruelty of capitalism would see to that. Now, at 622, Doron says that Gaza became an unimaginable place of horror and terror, from which from the moment Israel withdrew its soldiers in 2005 only increased. But this is because Israel has, in fact, continued to occupy Gaza to this day with brutal effect, serving as the most proximal driver of the material conditions there, essentially, basically producing conditions and eliminating them, those conditions which are essential for a sane society. Now, if you object to the term occupy, right, because you're saying, well, they're not, the prison guards are not literally standing in the cells or in the exercise gym with the prisoners. They're just on the wall, right? Or they've got their robots on the wall, and then they're at home, with the computers. If you object to the term occupy in that sense, and you want something clearer, just say Israel has effectively its hands around the throat of Gaza, and it rules it as the world's largest air prison, right? That's really if you want to think, why say occupy but not like it's got its own guys in there now apart from spies, right? Because that's a prison. Does anyone in a prison think that the prison owners basically run or control most of their life? Yeah, we do. And that's what's going on in Gaza since 2005 particularly. That is to say, the analogy of a prison is appropriate because most real prisons are terrible places to grow up and have a life in. Generally, the people who control the prison don't live there. They control the borders and therefore what goes in and out. Remember that Gaza is about the size, I think, of a chunk of the greater New York area, although, since I've rarely been to New York and I don't think about the numbers, that might be technically inaccurate. But it is quite a small place, right, for like 2 million people. And thus, the vitality of this region depends on commerce with the outside, right, to have any meaningful economy, just as all modern societies do in general. The prison owners, prison operators, whatever, this analogy, they are able to surveil the population, to send in guards, to do violent things, to search people, take stuff away, and of course they can fire weapons into the area from outside. All of this is done without the consent of the prisoners inside, and whenever they want to go outside, it is completely at the behest of the prison owners, who often have heavy conditions or demands for what those people need to do to prove they are worthy, right? That is, providing intelligence on what's going on in the inside, being spies, whatever, right? Okay. So in particular, right, how exactly has Israel basically made, in the words of Noam Chomsky, Gaza practically unlivable? Because, I mean, right, I think, lots of people, right, and Doron would agree, right, it's quote a hell, but what is that, how did that happen via Israel? Let's consider the following. At 6:30, Doron says that when Hamas was elected by the Palestinians, Israel had, quote, no choice but to institute a blockade there. Well, let's back up a second and recall what actually happened. In 2005, Israel, with the backing of its imperial patron, the United States, right, run by the Bush administration, after 9/11, all that stuff, right, it agreed to let Gazans have local elections. And, it just occurred to me, why would they have done that? Well, the United States invaded Iraq, and then it set up elections there. And, maybe that's part, part of the neocon dream was, yeah, let's give the other countries elections, and they will, as we'll see, right, we hope they'll give us the result we want, and so we get credit for promoting democracy in the Mideast, right? That just occurred to me. But regardless, right, for whatever reason, the United States and Israel agreed to let Gazans have local elections for who would be the local government. These elections were certified by ex-President Jimmy Carter as proper and fair. And what did the Gazans do? They picked the people they wanted to lead them, Hamas, which, remember, grew out of the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood based in Egypt. And the Muslim Brotherhood is, it has a political presence, right? It's like it's like the Zionist settler movement. They have right? They've got their politicians in the Knesset, right? Or, if you want to say back in the pre-mandate period or after, in the mandate period or afterwards, right? These are people with a group in government. It's like MAGA voters picking Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz, right? People who promote the steal, right? Groups of people. Do we think that these are somehow, that they're not worthy, that they shouldn't be in government, generally is clear, right? But that they don't have a right to be there according to the principle of democracy? Yeah, we let them be there. So they picked the people they wanted to lead them, Hamas. And as Noam Chomsky says, with his typical flat wit, what we, the United States and Israel, the supposed champions of democratic values in a world of barbarians, what did they decide to do? They decided to punish the Gazans for electing people they didn't like, right? That is, Israel and the United States. People who wouldn't rule as client kings, basically, or puppets the way the U.S. originally hoped to have in Iraq. And note that Israel and the United States, which at the time, this is, was included Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that they were so desperate to undo the effects of democracy that they had allowed, they tried to implement a coup in the Strip, but it failed. So are you starting to sense moral hypocrisy and double standards here? I sure do. It basically says that the United States and Israel never really intended to let the Gazans pick whoever they wanted, right? As a true nation, at least as true democratic principles would require, but only the ones the colonial powers would allow. And note, this is quite similar to what China is trying to do in Hong Kong. And the fact that the United States regularly, and in terms of the principle, correctly criticizes Beijing for it, right? This is hypocritical, right? Israel and the United States saying, well, they elected Hamas, so we decide, that was bad. Well, but from Beijing's point of view, the Hong Kongers, they're electing people that will be critical and want to separate their, their polity from the mainland. Why aren't they a threat? Or rather, why aren't they, too bad to be in office? So if the coup wasn't going to work, what else could Israel and the U.S. do? Well, sanctions, right? That's what the blockade was there. That's how it was justified. Sanctions. Supposedly the, quote, humane tool of statecraft. That's basically why it was implemented. It was there to get the Gazans to revolt and overthrow their own government. under the faulty reasoning, as we now see, that if the Gazans were made poorer and poorer by their prison masters outside because they elected the wrong people, they'll both choose and be, right? They both choose and be able to overthrow said elected officials. But as we've seen from cases like Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, right? Iran does still and had, right, crippling sanctions. Even Russia today, right? Such blunt sanctions not only fail to do what the West wants to achieve, they actually entrench the local rulers in power, both because the population goes from being, to exaggerate a little bit here, right, middle class, having bourgeois values, having reasonable chances of democratic or nonviolent change in leadership, to a massively impoverished underclass who are unable to do anything and they are basically too busy trying to survive to care about high-minded democratic processes. Alongside, at the same time, there is a small class of elites who know their entire fortunes are tied to propping up the central authoritarian ruler. Now, the situation in Gaza is a little different, right? But I think the conclusion, you could argue, is the same. The sanctions haven't worked. Now, I should also point out that when Israel and the United States and its allies imposed sanctions on Gaza for electing Hamas, the UN advisors to the region noted that Israel itself was guilty of many UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions, including illegal territorial exchange and human rights violations, rulings of the International Criminal Court of Justice. But it wasn't being subject to economic sanctions, right? I mean, the arguments that, again, the argument that Israel and the United States was saying, well, these guys are guilty of various war crimes or whatever, right, Hamas, when they themselves are, guilty of the same things. And this double standard will be seen again and again in the rest of what I have to say. Now, it is true, the fact that the blockade was meant, I guess you could say, to prevent all sorts of things from getting inside Gaza so that Hamas can't threaten Israel, although since it is also the case that Israel regards its own policy of mass intimidation and violent retribution against its neighbors as self-defense, we really should say, in the interest of objectivity, that the blockade prevents the people of Gaza from defending themselves adequately from Israeli depredations. But beyond this, the simple fact is the blockade is not reasonable. What do I mean by reasonable? Well, in the point of view of basically the most, reasonable, humane people you would expect, right? The experts and the people who don't have a big stake in, saying yes or no. They have concluded that it is a major cause of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and it goes far beyond what, is supposedly only meant for weapons. It excludes all kinds of equipment that has no application to weapons, as well as construction materials and various food items. So this goes along with Sara Roy's development argument, as well as what I'll talk about in a bit about Operation Cast Lead. You can read more about these, the way that this blockade isn't reasonable in Norman Finkelstein's book on Gaza, and from which I've drawn substantially here. The blockade has clearly led to a fundamental economic hardship. 90% of Gaza's basic ability to survive comes from foreign aid. Now, Doron does mention at 703 that Israel, quote, continues to supply Gaza with electricity, water, fuel, and humanitarian aid. But really, this is like a man who takes another man that he has no legal authority over because he is not enfranchised in the same society as him, with anything like the same rights that the First Amendment enjoys, and shuts him up in a prison that he is condemned to slowly starve in. But then he gives him a little bit of bread and water each day and then tells the world, you see, I'm giving this guy a little bit of bread and water. Don't I deserve credit for this? This seems quite ridiculous. And I hope that you can see here, there is a kind of mini waiting game, right? That's in effect. Since the cruel blockade decimates the economy of Gaza and prevents its some 2 million prisoners, including half of which are children, from having a meaningful, dignified life, many of those people will understandably hate their jailers and feel like they have nothing to lose except for getting revenge at them. And so they do attack Israel, which always responds by delivering massive death and destruction to the area, presenting it as pinpoint accurate bombing campaigns meant for recognized terrorists or infrastructure associated therewith, when in fact it leads to high civilian casualties and a complete death blow to meaningful modern life. I'll get back to this point in a minute. Here, I am simply saying that just as with other instances of the waiting game I've showed you, here the Israeli leaders know they're killing many people and ruining lives there, that this radicalizes much of the population. So that leads to more terrorist attacks, and more importantly, to the more importantly, in the perception of the bourgeois Israeli public, a sense that the Gazans are largely hateful fanatics who would never agree to live peaceably with the reasonable Israelis outside their prison. Once the media, military, and politicians portray everything under the blanket term, quote, Islamic terrorism, the Israeli population can imagine whatever horrors they want. And of course, they will have examples each year of some attack or another, with someone with small arms, with a knife or such, right? I'm putting aside October 7th here. This is, before that. Or ignoring, and they have the imagine of this stuff, ignoring the retaliatory strikes of their own country, which are conducted, quote, rationally and justly by a society that doesn't have hate and dreams of paradise on its mind, when bombs are dropped by fighter jets or drones, killing many, many more times the people as the original attack, right? So there's a mini waiting game here. At 7:11, Doron makes the interesting comment in asking how many countries do we know that give aid to a, quote, enemy country? And I point this out because it's revealing about the implicit line of thought here, right? And I'm sure this is, this kind of reflects, what other apartheid apologists would say. I'd like to point out the keywords enemy country. This actually reveals the way that Israeli leaders, and to some degree many Israeli apartheid apologists, justify their policies in Gaza by trying to have things, so to speak, both ways. On the one hand, Israel simply refuses to recognize Gaza or the West Bank as an actual Palestinian nation, right? If it did that, it'd be disastrous or at least in terms of politics, diplomacy, right? It'd be very bad for them. And it's also just a basic tenet of Zionism, right? So the Gaza and West Bank, they're not allowed, quote, to have an army, to conduct foreign diplomacy, to have their own currency, right? To have a place at the United Nations, mainly because the US and Israel block it, right? Its residents have no rights under the effective power that controls so much of their lives, that is Israel. All of this is basically because they're, under the control of Israel. And at the same time, Israel and US leaders regard Gaza as an enemy country when they want to attack it or frame Hamas in a certain way. So note, for instance, how Israeli President Werner Herzog recently spoke of all the residents of Gaza as enemy combatants who could be killed by the IDF due to their support of Hamas, or how Israel frames its violent actions in Gaza much as it would when dealing with a state, in particular fighting an administrative, political, and military organization, i.e. Hamas, which once, quote, destroyed, right? You blow up the Capitol building, right? You blow up the tanks, you kill the top leadership or such, that it effectively ends the possibility of future retribution. And as sociologists know, that's not really how you're going to get rid of the terrorism, right? Now, besides the fact that sociologists, right, sociologists, counterterrorism experts, and, a lot of ordinary people can recognize that this approach will not succeed unless outright genocide is committed. My point here is simply that the double game which Israel and the US play is revealed by the selective use of terms like enemy country, right? Just recognize the facts. And I'd also like to add here, right? It is an obscene double standard that the president of Israel is claiming when he arbitrarily declared that all Gazans were enemy combatants. The man says he thinks that general decent principles like the international humanitarian law, right, which says that one does not target civilians in armed conflict, he thinks that this doesn't apply to Israel, much like the United States claimed in its own war of terror. Herzog says this, even as he goes on and on about how Hamas targeting Israeli civilians is the most heinous act in the world. So if Hamas were to summarily declare that all Israeli civilians should be considered enemy combatants, right? It gets up in the UN and says that. Would anyone really take that as an excuse for what they did? If you consider only the relevant factors in making this comparison, I'll help you see that it's ridiculous. But of course, right, the powerful people in Israel and such, they bring in irrelevant factors because those are justifications, not explanations. I'd also like to make, as a side comment from 7:11 to 7:25, Doron's rhetorical question of how many countries do we know that give aid to another, quote, country, right? There's that middle double standard again. Another country which digs tunnels to kidnap its citizens, to fire missiles at them, like if we consider this if we consider this in terms of the spirit of the question, well, we know plenty of examples of countries that do that, or polities, right? They're basically examples of settler colonial nations or empires, like the Roman Empire's occupation of Judea, British colonial India, American occupied Iraq, right? That's just a few. I'm not saying that the kidnapping of Israeli citizens by residents of Gaza or the firing of homemade rockets from Gaza is good, right? It's bad, right? Violence is bad. But let's just state some objective facts. Those Gazans are tunneling through the prison walls built by the Israeli state, which, as far as their attitude over the past few decades indicates, it has no intention of dismantling, only tightening. And to be honest, most of the Israeli population feels that way, right? They are fine with that. They are fine with letting those people rot and have meaningless lives. There are thousands of Palestinians held indefinitely in IDF military detention centers where they have no rights, where they originally had no protections from being arrested in the first place, or one could say, kidnapped. I mean, that's how people on the ground would call it. There are documented cases of torture. They are technically held there by armed militants, right? I mean, these are people who don't belong to their own state. They're armed. And the, quote, detainees are technically captives. The difference is the Gazans, up until recently, the difference is one nation has all the power, the ability to control the narrative or influence it because it's backed by, another, the biggest world power, even as many, if not most, other members of the international community don't buy this stuff. At least they to some degree, they don't buy it. The fact is that Gazans, up until recently, fired what Norman Finkelstein had quaintly called bottle rockets in terms of the actual property damage and death they caused. Right? This is relative to the, compare that to the large ordnance that Israel dropped in the past into their open-air prison, or that they are doing right now. Right? The former, these rockets from Gaza, can shatter windows. It can lead to 1 or 2 injuries or deaths. That's bad, right? But the death and destruction of the latter, right, the missiles, the bombs that Israel uses, right, is many times larger than that of the former, leveling, destroying whole buildings or blocks, injuring and killing dozens or hundreds at a time. In fact, just today, right, I heard Finkelstein say, right, I mean, the amount of bombs, ordnance that has been dropped on Gaza in the last, within the last week or something like that, the first week after October 7th, is more than the total number of bombs, tonnage, right, dropped by the American military over all of Afghanistan in 1 year. All that. And somehow it gets swept under the rug by, as the words bombing, as military retaliation, as, we gave them advance warning. I mean, really, you don't think that's not overkill? Overkill, and overkill for what? But whatever, right? Again, it's a double standard. In 749, Doron also says that the Gazans themselves are turning Gaza into Afghanistan on steroids. But this is no more true than saying that the Judeans of the 1st century in the Great Revolt, or in the 2nd century under the Bar Kokhba revolt, turned their occupied territory into a wasteland, and that the Roman army had no choice in what it did. I don't think most Israelis would really, most of us, right? Most Israelis also would not accept that argument. So why should they accept the same argument at Gaza? Only ignorance and callous lack of empathy can explain such things. And since Doron does mention Afghanistan as an analogy, we do, of course, need to acknowledge that what has become clear to all, but which was predicted by, that was only now becoming clear to all, right? And in the beginning it wasn't, I guess, but it was predicted by several wise people at the time, whom most Americans did not listen to out of arrogance or blind rage, that much like how most Israelis and their government are behaving today, right? Sorry, let me say this again. What happened what's happening now, or has happened now in Afghanistan, wise people at the time after 9/11 predicted that this kind of thing would happen, or something like it. Most Americans did not listen to them out of arrogance or ignorance and blind rage. And a similar thing is happening with regards to Israel and their treatment of Gaza and the West Bank and such. But in terms of what's the analogy, right? Because if Doron mentions the Afghanistan analogy, let me sort of run with it more. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan led to hundreds of thousands of innocent dead Afghans, and it was poorly justified. There was no need, ultimately, to invade the country to get bin Laden and his al-Qaeda associates. the chief opposition leader to the Taliban at the time, a man who knew the long history of brutality in his country at the hands of colonial powers and local warlords, knew that the American invasion would be disastrous for ordinary people of Afghanistan, and he didn't want them to come. Most of the tax dollars that Americans sent there ended up going to warlords and their sycophants. They went to ineffective ordnance, equipment that was later given up to the Taliban, stuff like that, right? And when I say warlords, right, it's not just that they're generals, right? They really are people who have killed innocent people, right? Who just, they run things that are very unpleasant for the people. So if we're to think that Gaza is Afghanistan on steroids, it's even more likely that the Israeli military will not, in fact, ever come to rule Gaza as it would like, short of complete genocide and expulsion, a crime for which Jews and everyone should think is unthinkable. But, the IDF is basically committing large-scale ethnic cleansing right now, playing the waiting game. At the 8-minute mark, Doron responds to the claim that Hamas and Israel are the same. Hamas and the government and military of Israel are clearly not the same structurally. I agree with that. But Doron goes further in arguing that the IDF generally uses, he says, they generally use pinpoint weaponry only to target terrorists and militants, and it does everything it can to avoid civilian deaths. This is simply false. Not only should the arguments I've given up to this point, how the relation between Israel and the Palestinians, how the fact that this relation is structurally quite clearly a case of settler colonialism, that is, with all its examples of dehumanization and desensitization to violence, both in the abuser and the victim. Not only should all this make that clear, right, how it has consistently pursued a policy of land instead of safety, and that therefore the idea that the occupying force really does, in the meaningful spirit of the term, all of this should basically show that the idea that the occupying force really does, in the meaningful spirit of the term, quote, try as hard as possible to avoid civilian casualties. Not only should we be suspicious of this claim on comparative grounds, it simply is false at the level of hard facts, right? In fact, to show this, I'd like to present just a small portion of the findings that have come out of one of the best examples of Israeli brutality brought to bear on Gaza, that of the 2008 campaign known as Operation Cast Lead. And for this, I'll be drawing on Norman Finkelstein's book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. Let's do that, right? I mean, I was in Syria at the time, and I did see how, non-Americans, right, non-Europeans view this kind of brutality. In June 2008, Israel technically violated a peace agreement brokered by Egypt, and it sent in a raid into Gaza, touching off Operation Cast Lead. When Israel unilaterally declared a ceasefire in 2009, the U.S. Congress almost unanimously said that Hamas was at fault, while the rest of the world disagreed. In fact, the international human rights expert Richard Goldstein, who ultimately published the important Goldstein report on the massacres of Gaza, he led an international investigation into Israel's attacks and concluded massive human rights violations and massacres were committed by the IDF, and that while the Hamas also did some, it paled in comparison to Israel's. Indeed, a former Israeli intelligence official testified that Israel's goal in this operation was not self-defense, because the plans for the ceasefire were in place before events began. So, I mean, again, hopefully you have a vague idea of what happened, right? Israel sends in bombs there, right? Sends in tanks and stuff, right? So if this wasn't for self-defense, right? If it wasn't just a reasonable response, why did he do it? Simply put, it was because Israel feared it had lost the ability to dominate its neighbors through fear and the need to terrorize them again by making an example out of Gaza. That is clear from a number of Israeli sources who indicated that the aim of Operation Cast Lead was to deter enemies from attacking, as they had become less afraid recently. So what happened recently that led to this change? Well, once again, this is why knowing the history is important. Basically, Israel's retreat from Lebanon, or as Finkelstein puts it, the fact that Israel wanted revenge for its expulsion from Lebanon in 2000 was the reason. And it found its cause for revenge in 2006 with Hezbollah's killing of several Israeli soldiers and kidnapping of 2. Now, in the ensuing conflict, that is the Second Lebanon War of 2006, the IDF was ignominiously defeated by an inferior foe, especially on the ground. And in light of this defeat in 2008, Israel sought to convince the U.S. to join in an attack on Iran, but its regional foe, but the U.S. declined. So they needed another way to gain their standing back. Their standing. That is, show people that they can utterly destroy them by utterly destroying them. Now, one should note that another factor was in play here. Israeli leaders were watching the 2008 American presidential election closely, and they feared that in the event of Obama's election, there might be further support of a two-state solution. Now, note that Obama is just clear, right? He's just complete hollow neo-lib, who really didn't do anything very meaningful for most poor people. But the Israeli military concocted a reason to invade Gaza, to obtain some militants, and consciously knowing that this would set off the war. So this is just as the waiting game allows for. On the other hand, if Hamas had not retaliated on November 7th, right, when the IDF started to act, the IDF would have just continued its aggression until Hamas did attack. Now, the fact that the IDF was thinking of terrorizing people into submission as a way to maintain what it called, quote, peace, was specifically codified in a particular term. It was called the Dahiya Doctrine, of massive retaliation against every village that fires a rocket, with the purpose of causing massive suffering among the hundreds of thousands of civilians who will ultimately turn against Hezbollah. This is the term that the IDF strategies use, and they mean what I said above. Does that not actually sound very similar to the reason why Israel and the US originally imposed the blockade on Gaza? Yes, it should. As Finkelstein states, IDF officials hoped that through the Dahiya Doctrine, that Hamas would be finished for good. Now note that in bombing buildings and areas with schools, the IDF did not give the people warning in advance. On the first day of Operation Cast Lead, Israeli strikes killed 16 children and young men and women going to school, even as Human Rights Watch found that no Palestinian fighters were active in the area at the time of the bombing. Soon, the IDF dropped all pretense that its enemy was Hamas, as the former minister said that the real enemy was the defeat and humiliation in 2006, right? So he just comes out and says it. On the other hand, African jurist John Dugard's international report, independent from the Goldstein report, I believe, and also independent from the UN report, it concluded that the IDF did not seemingly target the southern tunnels of Hamas, even though it had the ability to do so, and instead it targeted other areas. So what are some of the things that the IDF did in Gaza that it does not talk about in more detail? And what are some of the things that the enemy fighters did not do that the IDF said that they did? Well, the IDF used white phosphorus in Gaza, which is a horrible weapon whose use is considered a war crime. The IDF denied that they used it, although it clearly was documented by human rights organizations. And by the way, one of the IDF targets for the white phosphorus was a UNRWA, right? The branch of the UN that basically gives teachers and supports basic services in the refugee camps in Israel and around the world, education and such, right? That facility was bombed, destroyed with white phosphorus, and the IDF lied about using it. And this led to a sharp rebuke by the UN president. And moreover, during the Operation Cast Lead, Human Rights Watch found that Hezbollah mostly stored its rockets in empty fields, and they left the villages when the fighting began. They did that to get away from the population. A U.S. Army study also concurred with this, in that the main fighting with Hezbollah soldiers happened in the Litani River with few civilians. So essentially, the Gaza militants were not deliberately using human shields. And note that over the 22 days of this bombardment, there were no battles between Hamas and IDF. Hamas mostly avoided confronting Israeli soldiers in the open. The IDF testified to things being mostly quiet in terms of resistance. And as there were hardly any militants for IDF soldiers to encounter, it's unreasonable that for the IDF to claim its soldiers had to make split-second decisions about whether someone in front of them was an enemy or civilian. And right, contrary to what I guess a Johns Hopkins University philosophy professor argued, right? So again, right, this is not an excuse. Even if in normal situations, like the fact that might actually be held for what goes on, killing civilians, is you need to pay attention to what the background conditions are. So on the other hand, what did some of the IDF soldiers do on the ground? Well, the IDF claimed to impress upon its soldiers the need to respect international law and utmost cautiousness when targeting items in Gaza. But independent research has shown the opposite. One IDF commander said he wanted aggressiveness in his soldiers and to bomb things that looked suspicious. Another said that he was basically told to shoot anything that moved. As Norman Finkelstein states, the IDF generals basically communicated that the lives of the Palestinians, no matter who they were, counted for very little in the light of objectives of Operation Cast Lead. And I'll just note here, right? I mean, how many of you viewers, right? How many of you have killed someone? How many of you have shot someone? Right? I mean, apart from like someone's breaking in, right? How many of you shot and killed? I think you will find that once you shoot and kill someone, it's easy to do again and again. And you can do that without being frothing math, like a bit frothing at the mouth, without sort of believing that you're going to go to heaven, right? Or that the reason, for killing people is going to heaven, without, singing religious songs, right? You can do all that, particularly when the mechanisms, the machines of death, allow you to do it by pressing a button. Do you think you're fooling anyone when you say, oh, I should be given a break because I wasn't trying to stab someone or cut off someone's head with a knife, but I killed 1,000 people? It's ridiculous. But more on this point, right, about the intentional destruction. IDF soldiers interviewed afterwards of the operation. They noted how vast the destruction of areas in Gaza was, with little or nothing standing up. Others said they knew that their objective was to totally destroy the infrastructure, right? And again, this is all supposed to be basically getting some militants, right? A sort of like, measured retribution. They knew that they were using massive amounts of firepower, killing innocents and shaking the earth all the time. Despite the IDF's claims to avoid wanton destruction of property, Amnesty International and other organizations testified to systematic destruction of orchards, neighborhoods, factories, and property. And just to be honest, if you look at the footage of Gaza after Operation Cast Lead, just as, you look at the footage of Gaza right now, you can easily see that the IDF was successful in its goals of utter obliteration. Right? I mean, here, there's not even a pretense, right? They're just saying, right, they're saying they want to get to the tunnels and such. Furthermore, UNRWA's statements about Operation Cast Lead testify to its convoys being shelled, its workers being killed, and that they're being damaged to U.S. buildings. And the UN investigations found that the IDF willfully targeted UNRWA facilities sheltering civilians, right? They purposefully targeted them, leading to the deaths of UN workers. And those UN reports also claimed that the IDF knew that Hamas militants were not using UN facilities for attacks, even as they continued bombarding them. Note at the time that Shimon Peres rejected these conclusions as outrageous and saying that Israel had the most moral army in the world. I mean, this just once again shows, if your arguments are based on these statements, that come from these politicians and the military spokesmen, I mean, that is, I'm not saying it's irrelevant, right? But that is, just on that is quite a low standard. And, this phrase has become famous, right? It's come back to haunt him, by Shimon Peres. In terms of interfering with medical assistance, as one might euphemistically put it. While Israel said that it coordinated medical assistance for wounded Gazans, the Red Cross and other aid groups said that the IDF fired on ambulances or otherwise created so many obstacles to get aid to the wounded that at least 250 Gazans died because of these interventions. So once again, I mean, if you're injured critically and you call an ambulance to get to the hospital, and and normally the ambulance could get there under normal conditions, but then gangs decide to have a shootout, right, or to terrorize your neighborhood, and the ambulance can't get there. Do you think you're going to find it okay? Like you're not going to blame the gang for shooting it up? So why should we not do that the same for Israel, right? In fact, and as we said, right, this stuff is often intentional. Note that on the contrary, while the IDF claimed that Palestinians and Hamas used ambulances for military purposes without citing evidence, Israel's own medical chief official named Magen David Adom, he denied this. Okay, so the claim that the ambulances are being used for military purposes by Hamas in this incident are, that just is false. Israel targeted the Islamic University of Gaza on the claim that it was a research center for weapons, but no proof was given by the IDF, nor was evidence found by Amnesty International later, right? So again, you can just put out these claims and not have evidence, and somehow it just becomes it's accepted, right, by some people. Now note, right, if the IDF's claims to use high-precision weapons is true, it means that it intentionally destroyed all of those above targets as deliberate policy, right? That's the point of using high-precision weapons, to avoid hitting things you don't want. And so, basically, it's not, what happened was not the result of some rogue actor or crude munitions. And if they do use crude munitions, well, oftentimes that is just against international, it's international principle, international law, right? What reasonable people who think about warfare, neutral experts basically, in sort of giving some statement about what might count as, quote, responsible use of weapons, or really just, manslaughter, I guess, if you want to put it euphemistically, that does say, actually, you can't fire poison gas into an area where there are civilians, right? That's not illicit use, so to speak, right, of weapons of war. And so if the IDF was instead using crude munitions instead of their pinpoint bombs, right, because Gaza is so densely populated, right, you just can't help but you can't help but hit citizens. And, that perversely becomes an argument by some apartheid defenders who say, well, what do you want us to do, right? We have to fire bombs in there, although, so we're going to have to hit people. Well, no, the obvious answer is don't fire bombs in there. Deal with the solution another way. How would you feel? Like, how would people of Tokyo feel, right, if the United States or, China said, there's a guy that committed crimes in our nation, a Japanese citizen, and now he's hiding out in Tokyo, and, we prefer to deal with it by killing him with a bomb. And because Tokyo's so dense, they kill some citizens of Tokyo. Do you think anyone would buy that argument? Why should we do it here? So what's the conclusion about how the IDF acted in Gaza in 2008? I'll paraphrase Norman Finkelstein again. Because none of Israel's cited enemies, Hamas, Hezbollah, were a real military power or governmental body, Israel could not claim to achieve a military victory over them. And this is the point I made earlier about Israel, the United States. Really any kind of big imperial power, right? Trying to control a big group of people. It's how they try to present such resistance groups, right? Groups fighting you, whatever, as being at a halfway point between a simple civilian, a simple population, and a full state, right? And importantly, right, again, because of that humiliation after, I think in 2006 in Lebanon, the IDF had to show to its own citizens, right, that this policy was worth them buying into, right? So, but they couldn't do it really just by saying, oh yeah, we attacked Hamas through surgical strikes or whatever, right? That wasn't really going to produce the results. All they could do was use massive force against a mostly civilian area to reduce general fear of the state. No other concrete objectives were sought or necessary. And in fact, according to one Israeli official, Israel had to show the world that it was, quote, crazy and would react violently to any provocation, right? So this is just clearly dismissing the idea of self-defense, right? And just pay attention, right? Because the Bush administration was kind of acting this way too, right? And just I imagine that's what Trump probably said too. So, but if you think that this sounds absurd, that leaders of state would think so maniacally, right? Again, you should just listen to what Israeli politicians and IDF generals are saying right now, including insane statements by Naftali Bennett, the general who said they're dealing with human animals in Gaza and such, right? It's not that unusual that people would say this. The fact is that the ratio of homes destroyed in Operation Cast Lead was about 6,300 Gazan homes for one Israeli house. The death statistics I'll show you on the screen. Do you think the IDF did its best to avoid killing people? If they really wanted that, they wouldn't have done the bombing at all. It's quite simple. only people who forget the background contextualizing frames would argue that. And finally, the Goldstone report, right? It concluded that the philosophical debate about whether an IDF soldier's life was worth one enemy's or civilians, or whether soldiers practiced due judgment in firing weapons was all besides the point. And just by the, but just as a side note, right? I mean, just think about how most people correctly react to the kind of, call them excuses or statements or, the pedantic discussions about, say, police violence against African Americans and poor people in America, right? I mean, when the police comes out, she says, well, we try to teach the cops to use restraint, and we said, hey, don't run or I'll shoot, or they all go through some sort of sensitivity training course or whatever. I mean, and yet still, poor black men get shot a lot, or arrested a lot and thrown in jail unnecessarily. I mean, do we sort of buy this kind of dialogue? Or more importantly, even if, yes, of course, at some point, people who are in the business of being police officers, you do know you have to have rules and such. I mean, this sort of morally sanctimonious debate about, well, like, was the police officer really angry, right, when he shot him? I mean, or does it really matter in the end? No, we conclude it isn't. There are bigger structural reasons that should be addressed so that we don't have to get into these little debates which distract people. Here, as the Goldstone report continues, the IDF conscientiously enacted a plan of mass destruction against a dense civilian area, and it wanted to do that precisely and solely to inspire fear that Israel would react in an equally insane, inhumane way the next time anyone attacked them. And I would say in my own words that this talk of sterility and, quote, trying to avoid civilian casualties and the frequent use of the term like military response by the IDF on Gaza to describe things like Operation Cast Lead or Operation Protective Edge in 2014, which killed 2,200 Gazans, including 500 children, is really just Orwellian euphemisms for barbarous death and destruction, which most Israelis buy into, and Americans, unfortunately, in an effort to not confront, in the case of the Israelis, right? In the case of Iraq or Afghanistan, I guess it'd be Americans, in order not to confront what their own military does on their own behalf. This language and the material causes behind it allows most Israelis to forget, that there's apartheid there, right? That there's this, that those people are in a prison that they have constructed. The fact that a state has such advanced weaponry that can effectively separate the executor of mass violence from its effects on the ground should not be a meaningful factor in judging the morality of the executor's actions. The effect on the ground is the same. It's all the same. All you have to ask yourself is, if you and your family were on the ground and killed by such applications of violence, if your house was destroyed, if you were significantly injured, would you mind that it came from a plane in the sky as opposed to a guy wearing a suicide vest? I don't think so. And again, this is the issue of perspectival simulation, because the correct reasoning would go, yes, ask what it is like for you to be in that situation, right? Where the only meaningful factors, as far as this example would go, would, all these other things that people sometimes bring in, like, well, like what? Like they supported Hamas, or, what, they hate us, whatever, or that we, I don't know, we gave a day's warning, or that we've got, the military tells us that they do X, Y, and Z. I mean, ultimately, right, the facts show either that's not what those people are thinking about, or it's just irrelevant, right? And again, it is this profound arrogance or just naive assumptions about what reality is like for the other people, right? Things stemming out of, yes, Orientalism, right? The way that Muslims and Arabs are portrayed in the media, in the kinds of selective stories that are shown to us. And the fact that increasingly in Israel, if you want to call them white, that's fine, most white Israelis don't have any meaningful contact with Palestinians outside of either service relations, seeing some guy's face on the TV as a quote terrorist, or knowing the rich Palestinians who are very sort of internationalized, or driving by. I mean, really, you can just see how this disgusting hatred and arrogance starts. Okay, so I'm coming now to my last points. Point number 10. It will also be long, but there are timestamps, and this is really kind of about the most recent acts of violence, right? So at the 8:45 mark, Doron speaks of how the IDF gave one day's warning to residents of northern Gaza to evacuate their homes before they obliterated everything on the surface, and how this should be taken as a point of moral credit for the army. I'd like to point out once again, how out of proper perspective this claim is. The Gazans are basically in a well-nigh unbearable Israeli open-air prison. In fact, the term people use now is concentration camp. Israel claims an authority over them it simply has no justification for exercising. This includes the right to obliterate their homes, where they face no consequences for killing as many as they please. The fact that the IDF gave a day's advance notice really is such a tiny issue in comparison that it really means nothing. And I can illustrate what a double standard this is by laying out the following hypothetical scenario. Suppose China today decided to conquer Israel and to allow its oppressed Uyghur population to begin settling much of its territory, much of Israel, under a recent movement of return and restoration of a Muslim Holy Land. All the Israelis in Haifa and Tel Aviv are given one day's notice to leave their houses and flee south, so that the Chinese army can obliterate the city structures and begin rooting out those Israelis who decide to fight, right? That is, Israeli terrorists or resistance fighters, whatever, who are hiding in tunnels and, little bunkers or whatever. Do you think that the people of Haifa and Tel Aviv should be grateful that they received this warning from the Chinese army, or that we, the international community, should regard the Chinese actions as excusable? I mean, this seems ridiculous. Double standard. In 8:55, Doron basically says that Hamas uses human shields in the cowardly understanding that, according to the Hamas thinking, in the cowardly understanding that the IDF will, out of moral restraint, not attack those militants. Well, not only is this fact simply not true in the case of Operation Cast Lead, where the IDF wantonly targeted civilian targets, you had no militants inside, right? So if you have no qualms about targeting civilians when there aren't Hamas militants there, why would you do it when they are there and there are civilians there? This is also just contradictory. Sometimes I don't. Well, actually, I think this is meaningful, right? It is contradictory to another line of thinking that Doron expresses in the video, and which other Israeli leaders have made quite clear recently, and in effect have been using it on earlier. They used it on early occasions when they killed people in Gaza. This is, namely, that all Gazans are collectively guilty for the actions of the militants, and so they have what's coming to them. So how can Israel claim or accuse Hamas of cowardice for hiding behind what Israel would itself regard as civilians, while also saying that such human shields are legitimate targets for its violence because they support Hamas? Now, you might technically argue that, well, the point is being made, is that sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other on the situation, but the fact is this. This is essentially a talking point used by a dominant military power to frame the nature of the conflict. One cannot rationally claim that Hamas uses human shields while also saying those human shields are legitimate targets for one's violence. And again, I'm not sort of saying Hamas fights, in some sort of pure valiant way or anything. I'm just showing the evidence doesn't support it, right? Why? Well, because the IDF does use human shields. And the references, the statements about that will appear on the screen. It's bombed quite a number of hospitals intentionally. But these facts are not widely broadcast to the Israeli public. The simple fact of the matter is that the Israeli military has changed since the 1960s as a consequence of how its own society has changed and the way it wants to implement its apartheid system. This is, overall, what happens in many empires and colonial states. And Chris Hedges, among others, have talked about how this has happened with respect to America's military and the U.S. Imperial ambitions, military ambitions abroad. while it is true that the Israeli military service is still largely mandatory for citizens, most Israeli citizens have become what Norman Finkelstein calls westernized or bourgeois, with higher expectations for the quality of life. And yeah, I'm bourgeois, right? Everyone here, apart from the unfortunate number of poor people, homeless people, right? We are all bourgeois at this university. So these people are simply unwilling to die to enforce an occupation whose effects they are largely screened from, that is, the negative effects they are largely screened from, and whose population they have decided to have only isolated contact with, usually in the form, again, of low-class service positions or stores, seeing the face of some guy's, male criminal on the television or something, right? These people certainly want to enjoy the effects. They want to enjoy the effects of the occupation, right? That is, they... and what do I mean by the effects of the occupation? Well, they don't want to have to deal with what it would take to make it better, and by getting rid of the apartheid, right? But you could also say for some people, right, they really do want Jewish supremacy, right? Like the right wing, right? The truly right wing, almost in terms of the meaningful political dimension in Israel, almost the entire spectrum, apart from maybe some Arab parties, the small Palestinian voices, right? That very small voice of dissent, a small amount of which we are beginning to see now. Like in terms of the Palestinian question or anything, it is really just right wing. But the really right wing people, right, who really want true Jewish supremacy, they derive clearly benefits, clear material benefits from the occupation, right, or from apartheid. But back again, so these soldiers, right, they want to enjoy the effects of the occupation or not deal with, not deal with the negative effects, I suppose you could say. But they're not willing to die for it. And yeah, I mean, that's how we are. I am, right? It's the nature of what the problem is, right? It's not a worthy problem for most people. So in fact, as I came to see myself in many of my tours of the West Bank, the occupation is becoming automated, privatized, right? Private guards now at these checkpoints, with all of the consequences, right? Of the fact that you can deny responsibility or plausibility, deny responsibility, right, when something happens, the state, right? The fact that it will be, the cost of this will probably, eventually be pushed more on the Palestinians more. It's automated. This is all done so that Israeli citizens can effectively lead high-quality lives in ignorance of the misery waiting behind the concrete walls. And professional career soldiers will be tasked with doing the remaining dirty work, where their empathy to their victims and moral resistance to what they do will be eroded because, yes, the abuser and the abused. Dehumanization on both sides in different ways. Okay. Now, Doron mentions how Hamas impeded the Gazans from fleeing the Israeli bombing campaign in the north most recently. I mean, this could very well be true for the reasons he says. But of course, one should also remember that Israel itself bombed these same refugees along routes that they themselves proclaimed to be safe. And of course, what can the IDF always say? Oh, we made a mistake, right? And who will hold them accountable? I mean, so far, no one. As I said for the 100th time, it really does sound sanctimonious to say that the IDF should be considered humane because it, quote, allows the Gazans to flee in advance of their massive campaign of obliteration. The fact that such actions are held up as a defense speaks of an extreme ignorance and therefore arrogant assumption of who Israel should hold itself accountable for. According to both their and the United States actions, they think they should be held accountable to no one, and that only they get to decide in the end what is right, who they can kill, what they can bomb. All you have to do, however, is exercise that perspectival simulation that I said earlier to see that if any one of us, we prototypically, quote, white, non-Muslim people, if we were subject to what the Gazans have gone through, we would immediately reject the notion that IDF's actions, as well as the apartheid system as a whole, is justified. Doron mentions the fact that Gaza also has a border with Egypt, wondering why that country does not open its border, or, rhetorically speaking, wondering why that country does not open its borders to refugees or relieve the blockade. Well, this is interesting, right? It is certainly not to Egypt's credit that as I said before, right, that it doesn't do this, right? But the fact is, the militants of Gaza have traditionally been aligned with Hezbollah and Iran, and the Egyptian military government is probably not eager to send in weapons if you opened up the blockade, right, on that side, perhaps and perhaps even more general supplies to the Gazans, right? Because that could make, I guess, if you want to perversely think of it that way, right, that would aiding in giving the Gazans some decency, I guess you would be strengthening Hamas. But if this is the case, so if this is the case, of course, shame on them for letting the people of Gaza suffer. But I do think Doron is unaware of the very obvious issue, which once again indicates the need to really consider the practical calculations that all these leaders make, including Israel's. Do you really think that in years past, that Egypt would be willing to open its borders to allow people and goods to flow in and out of Gaza, given that Israel wants to effect a total blockade of this little strip of land? You don't think that if Egypt did that Israel would simply invade and take over Egypt's borders, or apply pressure to its U.S. patron to turn the screws on Egypt to stop that? After all, the Egyptian military receives huge sums of money from the U.S. to do what we want. The Jordanian military, my understanding, is basically completely financed by America. So, of course, Jordanian military will not let any Palestinians cross, except for very strict circumstances, right? Or, maybe that's not the way to put it, right? That they're not just letting the border open, right? Even if many people in Jordan would be okay with that. Why would Egypt risk war with Israel over aiding a group of militants it is opposed to? So I think that's a very reasonable answer. It's not a saintly one, but none of these agents, these actors involved, right? The U.S. military, the U.S. military, or the IDF, the Israeli government, the Egyptian military, right, authoritarian regime. None of these guys are saints, so they can't really accuse one another of doing the wrong thing, I guess, in this kind of case. Note that at 9:45, Doron mentions slightly afterwards that if Egypt opens its borders to the Rafah crossing, it could solve the problem in seconds of the the misery, right, of the people in Gaza, so that Israel fights only terrorists. Now, not only does this ignore the likelihood that the militants would likely flee with the refugees into the south, the obvious thing that would come after what Doron proposes is simply that Israel would again illegally claim the Gazan Strip for its own settlement once all the Gazans are gone. That is literally what is happening right now in northern Gaza as a consequence of the IDF's massive bombardment and ground invasion. Another instance of the waiting game that I spoke of, right? This is the best example, right now, where the triggering event was something the Israeli military or the politicians did not want, in this case, definitely, but the kind of thing which it has known it can always profit from. So why would Egypt want to take on the burden of millions of refugees with armed militants among them, which often just means men with a fighting age, right, and access to a weapon, and also contribute to the total annexation of Gaza by Israel? Wouldn't Egypt's own citizens, do you think they would tolerate that from the leaders? Obviously, the more prudent solution, but not the humane one, right? Given that, as I said, the United States or Israel, right, as if they could sit in judgment of these acts. Obviously, the prudent solution is to just close the border. And that is what, mostly, right, almost entirely, that's what Egypt has done. In 10:04, Doron speaks of the refugees of Gaza as people who were expelled from Israel in the 48 War. Once again, this is a euphemism, or it's not really a correct description of the war crime known as the Nakba, as those people were expelled largely out of Haifa, the coastal area, by the Haganah as part of an ethnic cleansing. 250,000 people driven from rich and prosperous cities that were described by observers afterwards as ghostily silent, right? The other 500,000 Palestinians, as we've seen, often belong to areas beyond Jewish settlement and even beyond what the UN partition plan detailed, which the Haganah took an intentional act of territorial expansion. Doron does mention that surrounding countries, Arab countries, did not take in, I think he means the Nakba refugees, although there's always refugees afterwards, in 48. Well, first of all, this is just wrong. Palestinians were allowed to enter Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and other neighboring countries in significant numbers. This is what you can look up Benny Morris's description of this in Righteous Victims. Most of the rest of the Palestinians became internal refugees in their own land. These are the people in the refugee camp, or some of them, so those who were allowed to return or who were not displaced from Israeli territory initially, they came to be known those whom we call Arab Israelis, right? It's quite interesting because when I first heard this term in high school, I thought that, I was kind of surprised at first, like that is there what you'd have Arabs who are basically citizens, right? And nominally they are. I mean, they nominally enjoy all the same rights. I thought they'd be like, oh, it's like in America where, random immigrants come and, you settle down and you're Italian American, you're Chinese American. Well, no, what that largely refers to are Palestinians in these areas, particularly in Galaxy, that as my guide to the Gaza border area said, had Israeli citizenship thrust on them. And what does he mean? Once again, avoid the temptation for presentism. Right, at this time, right, these Palestinians, I guess they didn't get kicked out of their homes, but that's about all, right? They don't know what's going to happen to them. They don't like the Israelis generally. I mean, they like by this time maybe they certainly don't like the authorities, right? What they maybe thought about the neighbors, depending on what those neighbors did, maybe that's a different story. But like, do you think they want to become Israelis now, like to be known as that? No, that's not a natural reaction. And so the point is, right, my understanding is most of these Arab Israelis are those Palestinians that just kind of, stayed in the area. It's not like now where I do think, unfortunately, a fair number of these Israeli Arabs, they kind of don't care what happens in the West Bank, right? They've given it up as a lost cause. They are discriminated against, of course, in Israel, but that's not like in America happens. This kind of thing happens all the time. But at least they've got a kind of decent life, right? It's not like they know that, right? 100 years later. So why would they welcome that? Why would they welcome that status? But anyway, those are the Arab Israelis. And again, those who are internally displaced came to live in what we call the refugee camps like Jenin, which are subject to brutal IDF raids, and they are entirely supported by foreign aid, right? By necessity. They can't be incorporated into the polity because that would mean, those refugees just, they don't have a claim, according to international law, to their land and property. You wonder, since Israeli policy and the attitude of so many Israelis sets up so much store on the land, can they really blame such people for not leaving? That's worth noting. I would hope not. But anyway, let's just take the spirit of this argument. The idea that Arab countries do not allow Palestinians to enter their country as refugees, as Egypt did with regard to Gaza, as it also similarly treats Gaza. I certainly don't think that the corrupt and often authoritarian governments of many of the Arab states are charitable, right? Or rather, any more or less charitable than Israel or the United States. But I would like to ask Israelis if they would be willing to take a permanent 20% reduction in their standard of living, or to take in a large group of refugees who showed up their border, Jewish, Arab, or whatever. Would most Americans be willing to take a similar reduction in quality of life to accept all of the South American refugees at the Mexican border, who often have fled drug cartel violence or economic impoverishment directly related to U.S. economic policy? Most Americans would not, and probably most Israelis would not either. So this issue of how the Arab countries did not take in the refugees, recognizing the Arab countries were just much, much poorer, well, not saintly, but then again, I mean, who is in the position to really consistently, with moral consistency, sort of point the blame here among nation states, right? Or because these points, this point that Doron is making, I think, well, I don't know if the government is so foolish to kind of make that claim, but anyway. At 10:08, Doron says that such Arab countries never gave the Palestinians living in them equal rights comparable to that of their own citizens. At least I think that's what he's getting at, or rather what I think he's getting at here is there is no pan-Arab solidarity in the way that there is supposed pan-Jewish solidarity. And the former is a shame, right? That there's no pan-Arab solidarity, which led to the letting in of the refugees and such, or giving them equal rights. Well, I do think it is a shame that people in general limit their sense of empathy and concern to limited groups based on various historically contingent identities, and that the fact that Muslims, Shia and Sunni, right, they have animosity based on certain historical differences, right? All that is shameful, and I do think that the tragic experience of Jews in Europe has led to a particularly strong sense of ethnic solidarity among Jews. They have essentially been persecuted and suffered so much, right? The European Jews, not the ones in the Middle East, historically, because those did not suffer overall nearly as much persecution as the ones in medieval Europe. Now, we could point out, well, the solidarity has unfortunately sometimes not been extended to the Eastern or Sephardic Jews in Israel, right? More in the past, right? Who often feel greater cultural affinities with their Muslim neighbors. That's in fact what a very courageous, very compassionate Sephardic Jew named Sami, who works at a southern Israeli university. He works basically he's not so much just a straight out Palestinian rights activist, but he definitely understands that, and that's part of his plan, right? But he's part of more general kind of reconciliation work among Jews. He himself has said, yes, he feels much more at home around Arabs. Right, because ultimately his family, I think, was from Morocco. But nevertheless, we have to, on the one hand, we have to be careful about confusing what a country's government thinks about something versus what many of its citizens think or do. There is, in general, among the less affluent and cosmopolitan parts of the population of, the Arab countries or surrounding Israel, there's much more support for the Palestinian right of self-determination. The anti-democratic governments, however, often choose defensive pacts with the United States and Israel, that is, the Abraham Accords and these other normalization agreements, because they are competing with each other, right? Siding with the United States and Israel, so to speak, under quote normalization, that's really part of this Iron Triangle business and, playing political games with each other. Whereas, in general, the population of the Muslim world does stand with the Palestinians. How far that would extend to welcoming immigrants, I don't know. But again, who's pointing, who can point the finger here so much? And finally, I would like to point out just how sanctimonious it is to shame the various Arab countries for not admitting and giving equal rights to the Palestinian refugees of the Nakba, when Israel itself is the entire reason those Palestinians are both refugees and without rights, under the power of the Israeli state. Israel expressly expelled those people because they were not Jewish. It refuses to give those people any rights, even though they are refugees within their own, within the Israeli state, basically. And here I do include the West Bank and Gaza, since Israel occupies them. Even though many of these Palestinians actually work in the Israeli economy and provide a fundamental underpinning for it as laborers. This is an entirely hypocritical claim, right? To point how shameful that the Arab countries don't give the Palestinian refugees in their land citizenship and such. I think they should, right? That is kind of a moral failing, but again, to sort of make that the issue here, I think is just a complete distraction. At 1033, Doron states that Israel is being unfairly blamed for the plight of the Palestinians. I think basically he's talking about October 7th, maybe. And he connects this to an analogy where he says, if one man rapes another man's wife, what's he supposed to do, right? Or where there's murder of the son and such. He says, what is the appropriate response for the second man, right, the victim? Well, once again, we can see here a fundamental blindness in this typical Israeli position. And here, don't just like this exact analogy, I'll get to it in a second, right? This kind of just numerical, us or them kind of argument. This is a blindness which is simply at odds with the historical record. The analogy should be more like in the beginning, the second man kills some family members of the first man and expels others from their homes permanently and lets his own family members live there. The second man's family never recognizes the first man's as worthy of the same rights as themselves. The first man's family continues to expel other members of the second man's family, and eventually the second man retaliates, killing some of the first man's family. The first man's family then kills many more of the second man's family and locks many of them up. And so this cycle continues, with basically each cycle of violence involving many more times of violence coming from the first family compared to the second, but where still everyone is unhappy and feels, well, let's say psychologically, right? They feel unsafe. The main difference between the first man and the second man's family, though, is that the first man's family has the vast majority of the power. They really do have much more control over what can happen. Most, but not all, of the first man's family has never really been interested in coming to true equal terms with the second man's family, who by now has a certain members of his own who feel likewise, rather than rather kind of coming terms through a lack of violence, or rather, so the most people of the first man's family, if you can follow this analogy still, right, has never been really interested in coming to true terms peace, right, with the second man's family. Rather, what they want is a lack of violence through terror and domination. That is the better analogy here. And I should repeat for the thousandth time, in response to what Doron says in 11:13, that the IDF and Israeli citizens have done all the things, they have done all the things to the Palestinians that Hamas has done, right? All these things at 11:13. IDF and Israeli citizens, I think it's usually these legal settlers in the West Bank, right? They have all done the things to the Palestinians that Hamas has done to Israeli civilians, except for the possibility of rape. I'm not sure about that, right? But it's been doing it in far bigger numbers. The only difference is that it is done with tanks, long-range sniper rifles, large-scale ordnance. It's done in detention centers instead of private basements. It's done without a massive hostile media apparatus that has an agenda against it. And it is done by people who know they can do their evil deeds and be back home by 8 p.m. in time to have a barbecue on their patio. They can disguise their crimes with their family or to themselves under the impersonal language of bureaucracy. And they can basically look forward to another day in a bourgeois society where they are treated with respect. That's the difference. In 11:21, Doron says that the IDF is not using its power so that it can wipe out Gaza in 2 seconds. Well, I think that's half correct. The IDF is using its power the way we have seen it use it in the past, and the way we are seeing it right now. It basically either ethnically cleanses the area of Palestinians if the current political situation, i.e. if the international community won't stop it, that is, if the United States won't stop it, if there's a significant attack on it from Gaza, that makes this achievable. And if not, it will maintain the Gazans in a state of siege indefinitely with a new line of concrete walls and razor wire, surveillance towers and raids and bombing. In other words, the IDF is using its power in accordance with the waiting game. You should go over the historical record and check if I'm right on this. Now, from about 1140, the point being made here is that if the Gazans elected Hamas in 2006, for which they were arbitrarily punished by the United States and Israel, I would say, that counts as supporting Hamas, and Hamas is now committed to the destruction of Israel. Well, I don't know if this really needs pointing out, but Israeli President Werner Herzog, the IDF leadership, most but not all Knesset politicians, and many ordinary Israelis have declared all Gazans legitimate targets of their massive bombing campaigns and ground invasion, and that has been the pretext for military attacks that have killed many thousands of people, over 3,000 of which are children. All of those children would have been too young to support Hamas by voting for them in the 2005 election. So why should they be legitimate targets, right? I mean, that's the point of holding children sacrosanct, right, from all this violence, because they're too young, right? They haven't had the time to make the bad decisions. They haven't had the time to be able to defend themselves and such, right? This is an exact example of this. The number of Israelis killed on October 7th was 1,500, with some 500 children. Now note here, I'm not arguing about the comparative value of life. I'm simply showing the consequences of what Doron and President Herzog are arguing. The current Israeli administration has violated the Geneva Convention. It's committed many war crimes in the eyes of international observers, right? This very administration. These elected officials simply are war criminals. They are terrorists, right? They want ethnic cleansing. They feel rabid, right? That very thing that so many Israelis and Americans says is, the reason why we get to kill them, or why, we have to have so much of our policy be defined about killing and stopping them rather than doing something else, right? Like they really are rabid, right? Go look at the videos of these people on TV. And these officials were elected by a majority of Israeli citizens, right? That's what it means to be in democracy. And I do think, right, in its halfway, of course, that is a praiseworthy aspect of Israeli society, right? Right, but, it's just half of the story. Now, does that mean, though, that the 1,500 Israelis who were killed on October 7th were legitimate targets of violence, since the same current administration they perhaps had voted for is guilty of other crimes against humanity, such as the entire occupation of the West Bank and Gaza? Well, I would hope we say no. So why should anyone else say yes to the collective guilt of the Gazans? Only moral hypocrisy could explain this. It is what Chris Hedges has called a distinction made by those in power between the worthy and unworthy victims of violence. And that's just exactly what's going on here. It's also interesting to note that, according to the historical record, Hamas was actually open to a two-state solution up until Israel and the United States imposed its crushing blockade in 2006. That's what the former head of Mossad, Ephraim Livy, stated was true in the 1990s. And that's what Hamas spokesperson Khalil Mishal said as late as 2008. Now that changes after the Israeli blockade, right? I mean, it seems like the logic is the reverse here, right? The blockade leads to more, at least, in this one, well, I mean, yeah, in general, it just leads to more extremism. It's not a response to their extremism, at least not a reasonable one. And of course, it should be pointed out that Israeli state policy has also consistently sought, or been, the destruction and prevention of any possible Palestinian state. It has literally never sought to recognize Palestinian statehood. It has consistently sought to stop, by whatever means are necessary, nationalist movements among the Palestinians. It has assassinated individuals who might become national leaders, or, because it wants to, right, if nobody was watching. And many other things in this regard. It even makes illegal all forms of nonviolent protest in the West Bank for Palestinians. And it's quite interesting, right? Because I participated in a nonviolent protest in the West Bank, conducted or held, made up of basically conscientious, what Cornel West would call love warriors. Those Israelis who recognize what is going on in the West Bank is wrong, and they held a nonviolent protest. And I got to see this funny way that, the Israeli army there, it doesn't know what to do, right? It treats the Israelis so differently, of course, right? I mean, at least I would say so, right, than the Palestinians, right? It was really like this touch and go game where both sides know, one side knows it can't really touch the other. And the people in my group, right, you could say overall we're more timid or such, right? We weren't going to sort of like get it, like risk being shot or something, right, or beaten up. But we get to do the protest. The Palestinians, if they tried that on their own, right, they probably would all be just rounded up and sent to detention. They could be shot and beaten and such, right? But the point is, right, Israel makes all kinds of nonviolent protest in the West Bank illegal, right? That's because they fear what a nonviolent protest movement would look like. It is sought to explicitly expel, as many Palestinians from the region in the Nakba, since actually having a sizable population in an area is necessary to forming a state there. So really, right, it is committed to the destruction of Palestine as much as, I guess now, Hamas is committed to the destruction of to Israel. And I'll just note, right, I mean, this is really just a kind of question I'm wondering here. Sometimes when it says the destruction of a state, it doesn't mean the massacre of the entire population. It means the dismantling of, that state as a power institution, right? But anyway, it's not really relevant. So while we might rightly condemn Hamas's, quote, current position after Israel commits its own crime against humanity in Gaza, the simple fact is that its own official policy and the attitude of most, but not all, of its own citizens, right, is not much better. Israel is just not much better in this regard. But Doron does note in the 12-minute mark, that, quote, ordinary Gazans also participated in the evil acts of October 7th. And yeah, I mean, again, I don't, as Finkelstein himself said, right? I mean, knowing exactly how these kind of organizations work is not clear, right? I mean, maybe some investigation will take place, but Israel, I don't think is really at all interested in that, because that would sort of go against the simplistic narrative it's trying to tell. It's precisely in connection to this that I think viewers would find very interesting a recent interview with Norman Finkelstein about his understanding of what happened on that day, from the point of view of the 1,500 men or so who burst beyond the bounds of their lifelong Israeli prison. I've provided a link to this, to that long interview there, but also summarize it here. Basically, Finkelstein talks about the Nat Turner slave rebellion in Virginia, in America in 1831, where an enslaved Christian preacher, right, black man, named Nat Turner, led a violent slave uprising against the white masters, killing white slave-owning families to a total of about 55 men, women, and children. As Finkelstein puts it, these slaves mutilated the bodies of some of their victims, right? I think it may even been evisceration or something, right? Soon afterwards, the rebellion was stopped by armed white militias, who, however, went on a revenge spree of their own. They didn't just kill the rebels, right? They killed dozens of other black slaves, many of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion. Those white militiamen beheaded some of the slaves and put their heads on pikes. Sometime after this rebellion happened, one of the most prominent white abolitionists in America, William Lloyd Garrison, wrote a proclamation in which he excoriated the hypocritical liberals who said they were, these liberals who said they were anti-aristocratic, they supported the rights of, quote, free men, but who were perfectly fine with institutional slavery in the United States. He took aim with the pathetic debates taking place about how far the white militias should have gone in putting down the rebellion, how the hatred in the slaves was barbaric and irrational, and how they these slaves should have endured their treatment peacefully in the hope that their emancipation would come through other means. Garrison basically said he could not condemn the slaves for the violence they committed against their oppressors, and that the arguments about how much violence was justified within institutional slavery, all of these were disgusting distractions from the one moral imperative that stood above all else: emancipate the slaves, because that was the biggest elephant in the room, the thing so many milquetoast liberals and, yes, reactionary elites, right, the white slave-owning class, obviously, right, that they refused to talk about. That was the thing from which any meaningful hope for peaceful coexistence between black and white man could flow, right? Needless to say, Garrison was bold at his time for making the statement. He had a bounty on his head in the South, right? But today, most Americans, and probably most Israelis who know, most Israelis, right? They're acculturated to this kind of general cultural issue, let's say. They would not only agree with Garrison, but they would also like to think that if they were around in 1831, they would have stood with Garrison. They would have been an abolitionist, and they would have stood against the 90% of the 90% of the white people who did not question the institution of slavery. But the only way of knowing that, right, the only way of knowing whether you, right, are like that, is by looking at how we behave in our own time with respect to a situation that is sufficiently structurally similar to the original, right, as far as the moral argument is concerned. And I think that what has been going on between Israel and Palestine for more than a century is sufficiently similar to the Nat Turner Rebellion as far as telling whether someone really gets the important point and would stand on the right side of history, whether they have the right position. Was the reason Nat Turner and those slaves, the reason that they threw off their chains and killed those white people, general anti-white hatred without any historically motivated conditions? Were the slaves, quote, ungrateful or unappreciative of what their white masters did for them? Or, I don't know, like other Europeans abroad, right? I don't know what they're sending. I mean, that's not the right analogy, forget it. Right, that they were ungrateful for what their white masters did for them to make their conditions more bearable. And note, right, this is not just a completely obvious rhetorical question, right? Like, you could imagine, yes, your you're a white man, you grow up in the society, you find yourself, I guess, being part of a white slave-owning society, family, right? But you've got a bit of a conscience. You're not gonna, completely rebel and get killed or jailed by freeing the slaves, but you try to be nice to them. And then you, in turn, get murdered, right? By the slaves, I guess, right? I mean, but the debate that involves this, that this is somehow the end debate, or how much, say, were these slaves to be condemned for killing, right, for killing these white slave-owning families who included women and children? How much were the white militiamen to be condemned for killing not just the slaves who rebelled, but many more who had nothing to do with it, and were then offering financial compensation for those whose owners wanted to it, right? I mean, you could just make a parallel between the questions going then and now. Most of us are able to come to, I would hope, right, we'll come to agreement on the answers to most of these questions. And even if we cannot, we would all agree that these questions all fall far second to the moral and pragmatic imperative of emancipating the slaves. That is the measure of whether you really understand the moral dimension of the picture, as well as the practical one as far as what really leads to lasting peace. And we should expect no less with regards to ourselves now in Greater Israel, right? Greater Israel meaning sort of the, kind of the, I don't know, it's not even that it's on the map, right? Sometimes the map isn't the same, but, sort of the Israeli interior and then the West Bank and Gaza, right? The colonized areas. And the apartheid. Or even if you don't want to argue about that with respect to Gaza right now, end the blockade, period. All else may be relevant to how one acts from the assumptions of this first imperative, but it is not superseded, right? Once again, I think you will be surprised that where there is a will, there is a way. Or at least, well, yeah, I would like to think so, right? And the fact that so many Israelis saying, how could we possibly make this work? I think that's because really they are not willing to consider options that are feasible, but they cannot recognize. In fact, this gets back to a point that I wanted to say about this kind of tit for tat kind of mentality, the way of thinking about it. I remember when in Israel, there were two reasonably reasonably educated people, one that I talked to and, was trying to see why they, what they thought about apartheid and the Palestinians and such. One was a Tel Aviv University archaeology grad student, a guy with a lot of experience in the field. He had experience working with Palestinians. He carried a gun around him, and I asked about him why he had that stuff, right? He had been a soldier and such. And the other was, I think, a computer science master's student. And when I sort of explained the cases and such, all the brutality in Gaza, I was quite amazed at this attitude they gave, which, it's sort of seen through some of the things I've said before. But they say, well, what do you want us to do? That's what the Tel Aviv guy said, right? What do you want us to do? Like, we've got the tank. Like, I either have to shoot the tank, fire it, or not, and I can't not do it, right? There has to be some violence there that's going to just lead, that leads to the stopping of whatever current attack is going on, right? And then the second guy, he asked, well, then what do you want us to do? You want there to be equal numbers of Palestinians and Israelis killed? Like, if there was equality there, would that be fairness? Is the way I'm saying it, right? And I presume he means equal numbers in high numbers, because if it was equal numbers in almost really, really low numbers, you could say we've done a good job, right? That's not, I think, what he meant. And what is amazing, right, is that, at the time they said that, I just understand why they were saying this, but I think I do see it. That is, these people really cannot, right, they just don't give credit to the idea that there is a third solution, or that the imperative of ending the occupation, that as a goal, let's say, having as a goal is just not sufficiently imperative for them, right? And, particularly like the first guy, the Tel Aviv guy, it was just amazing how inconsistent, hypocritical his ideas were, that he was not aware of this, right? I mean, just sort of the things he thought, it was just really quite amazing. And again, this is like a guy getting his PhD. But, it comes about when you are isolated from the other group, when you don't know much about them, when you come to fear them, right? Like when the white, the black man comes walking down the street and you don't have black people around you, whatever, right? You and your white guy, you fear them. Whereas if you're a black person, maybe it's the other way around, whatever. I mean, just you can imagine a sort of situation that I'm trying to say here, right? That's what leads to the fear and the exaggeration of, the fear, or the sense of danger. That's what Israel is doing to itself, right? It is choosing to isolate itself from these people, and then it makes them fear them anymore. And it says, no, we can't possibly treat these people humanely. If we lift up the oppression, they'll just come back and murder us. And of course, because there's enough sort of energy in the cycle of violence, you get examples of something, right? You get examples of violence of some sort. And then people say, no, that's it, right? We're done. We're going to, again, this is the Israeli military applying massive violence that Israelis seem to have not a lot of problem with, right? It is ultimately born out of the inability to see the humanity in the other side. And yes, by now there is, some, just like with those slaves in Nat Turner's Rebellion, that is technically there among a portion, I'd say, of some of the people. But really, it just does not reflect the reality, right? There really is no reason to think that if the apartheid were lifted now, that all these Palestinians would decide to commit suicide, basically, by trying to go and kill as many Israelis, or like on some special night that they're going to do that, right? That is really ridiculous. That is not the same thing as, let's say, stochastic and really ultimately low-level violence, if you want to put it in perspective, that could happen, right? But to be honest, if you look at the arguments I'm giving, overall, Israel has dug a hole in itself. It has decided to do this, right? And I'm speaking in a general sense, right, throughout generations. And that's not just my opinion, right? If you want a very just kind of by nuts and bolts kind of policy analysis by a guy who really just speaks very frankly without any kind of moral philosophical notes to it, look at what John Mearsheimer has said about this, right? This is just common knowledge, I would suppose, by rational people. Beyond that point, in 1213, as a side note, Doron says that the IDF's massive bombardment on Gaza is, in response to October 7th, is a reasonable action because it told the Gazans one day advance to leave their houses so they could obliterate everything, make a ground invasion, and in the case, in the case that they can completely dislodge militants from the tunnels, they can claim the northern half of Gaza permanently for themselves. In light of everything I've said, this justification is just unsupported, right? In 1242, Doron says that he's shocked by what happened, presumably referring to, right, the 1,500 men from Gaza doing very evil deeds on October 7th. But he's not apparently shocked by Israel's response. Quite surprising. Well, I think most people who understand the history of Gaza and Israel would also be shocked about the scale of violence on October 7th. But I think that if we look a little bit further, Doron does not seem to really understand why it happened, why those 1,500 Gazans chose to commit those violent acts. The only explanation can be some kind of generic fact about Islamic terrorism and hatred of Jews. For pretty much the rest of the video, that's what he talks about. He connects, the events of October 7th to violence in France, so-called Islamic terrorism in France, the United States, how all of this is part of the same thing, the killing of innocent men, women, children, old men and old women, and where the goal is to spread as much terror and destruction in a population as possible, right? In a population. Because, the Islamic terrorists, right? They think they have their own in-group, right? Osama bin Laden, or as I'll talk about in a minute, like Mohammad Omar, right? They all think they've all got their own, they've got their in-group, right? The good Muslims, right? The righteous ones. They don't mean to kill them. It's always some group of people, even if in reality that group is actually very big in the world, right? So back to the point, right? Well, as I said before, right? All of these things that Doron just listed, they are literally true of the IDF and Israeli citizens. That is quite clearly the conclusion of the Goldstein report about Operation Cast Lead in 2008. The Israeli military officials used the euphemism mowing the lawn, right, for what they were doing in Gaza there, making everyone there as terrified as possible of the Israeli state. That is literally state terrorism. That's the term for it. And it is every bit as despicable as what we imagine by the phrase Islamic terrorism. And note, by the way, what a double standard is being applied here in terms of whose violence is acceptable and whose isn't. Do you think that if Hamas explained what it was doing on October 7th as mowing the lawn, do you think that anyone would think that its actions any more acceptable? No, they wouldn't. In fact, in a recent interview with the BBC in England, a Hamas spokesman said that on October 7th, that no command was given to target civilians, to the the fighters, I guess, in Hamas. Only target the military. Their actions, in other words, were not about collective punishment. Many people would not find this explanation either trustworthy, or if it is meant sincerely, that is satisfactory justification. So then why do these people find the IDF's statements about military response and targeting only civilians or giving people advance notice before obliterating their homes any more tolerable? Only if there is crude belief that we are the civilized ones while they are the barbarians. And I will add here a quick example that is equally instructive. During the Great March of Return, was it in the 2000? I mean, it must have been. I forgot exactly when. Thousands of Gazans decided to engage in peaceful protest against the fact that they were being held for perpetuity in their Israeli-controlled prison. They did what the enlightened Western world wanted of them. They engaged in civil protest, just like Gandhi and Martin Luther King did. And of course, right, Martin Luther King and his people, right, they did suffer violence for their peaceful protest, right? Martin Luther King was assassinated, or assassination is the right word, right? He was killed. They marched. So the Gazans, they marched up to the Gazan border without weapons or hostile intent. What did this get them from the IDF snipers waiting for them from a distance? According to a UN report after the fact, those snipers shot down old men and women, children, handicapped people, people in wheelchairs, journalists, and doctors. 240 Gazans, including 46 children, were killed by those IDF soldiers who were in no danger of harm. There's no risk of harm, basically. 36,000 people were injured, including 8,800 children. They were killed and hurt simply in cold blood. And as the IDF soldiers mowed them down to spread as much terror in the protesters' ranks as possible. And by the way, you could probably imagine some of those children, some of those teenagers, they may very well have decided to go join that group of 1,500 men on October 7th. Do you think maybe if they hadn't suffered the trauma during the Great March of Return, they might have decided to stay home? Quite possibly. So, in the end, right, what did the enlightened, compassionate world give the Gazans much in return for their actions? They didn't do much, right? I'd also like to note that if Doron is like most Israelis, Americans, or Europeans, he likely does not know much about the history of what we might better call reactionary fundamentalist Islam. Or call it Islamic, Islamic terrorism maybe is, apples and oranges, but whatever, right, they're linked. I certainly don't blame him, since this is something specifically avoided in typical Western education. It might be surprising to learn that one of the classic examples of this reactionary fundamentalist Islam was born in what was born in what we now call Saudi Arabia in the 18th century, or Wahhabism, right? It started as a response to the crisis of European colonialism and the cultural values that went with those colonists. I'm not saying at all that what Wahhabis believe is somehow, good or morally justified, but again, we need to look at the bigger picture. It might also surprise Doron and other people to learn that if you actually read the writings of someone like Osama bin Laden, you will actually find valid criticisms of how European and American powers have treated the Middle East and Muslims in general. If you look to the origin of the Taliban, you will find interesting things. So let me read here a summary of the group's origins from Meredith Reunion's book, History of Afghanistan. Many Westerners might be surprised that the Taliban originally formed with the noble intention to unify the country under a purity stance towards Islamic rule. Since the retreat of the Soviets, many Afghans had grown tired of the corruption, the fighting and brutality of the Mujahideen warlords, and the toleration for such acts in a country that had little choice in the matter. Before the official formation of the Taliban, a Muslim cleric named Mohammad Omar, he was revolted at the disturbing news of several Mujahideen men who had captured 2 young girls and were holding them hostage and subjecting the young girls to rape and torture. Angered by the 5 years of corruption and debauchery that these so-called Islamic warriors had brought to Afghanistan, Omar gathered about 50 students from the local madrasas and led these young students into the Mujahideen camp, freeing the teenage girls and hanging 2 of the Mujahideen offenders. 2 months later, Omar led these students again into Kandahar to rescue a young boy suffering the same fate by the intolerable Mujahideen. Revitalized by creating this wave of defeat against the Southern Mujahideen forces in Afghanistan, the Taliban officially banded together and set out to conquer the remaining cities around the country and end the corruption. For many, the newly formed Taliban was a wave of hope that these students would unite the country in peace and put an end to the insufferable acts endured under the Mujahideen warlords. The first true act of the Taliban occurred in October 1994, when the Pakistani government sent an armored convoy to Turkmenistan via Herat and Kandahar. Armed Mujahideen warlords attacked the convoy, but the Taliban ambushed the Mujahideen aggressors, overcame these forces, and allowed the convoy to continue into Kandahar. The Taliban proceeded into the city as well, fighting the Mujahideen forces and overcoming them by killing many of the leaders and imprisoning others. The Taliban announced the movement in Kandahar to free the country from the overarching corruption that had plagued this land, and further sought to bring the Islamic way of life to Afghanistan. So, the founder of the Taliban was fighting against the brutality and the corruption of the American-backed Muslim zealots, other Muslim zealots, Muslim zealots, that was visited upon the Afghan people. The Taliban were not the problem then. They were welcomed by Afghan villagers. Meredith here continues. In 1995, Omar announced that the Taliban would be more than just a political force against the Mujahideen. He desired the Taliban to act as warriors in a jihad against the Muslims and Muslims who harmed the Afghan people. As the leader of the Taliban, he vowed to lead these forces across the country to implement Islamic order. The Taliban repeated this method throughout the cities of Afghanistan, and their reputation for allowing bloodless retreat enabled these religious zealots to overcome Mujahideen forces with relatively little effort. The Taliban was also assisted by instructing a smaller force to march ahead to the village and announce the impending arrival of the Taliban. Thus, they encountered little resistance, and furthermore, most villagers were glad to assist the Taliban in eliminating the extortionist comrades of the Mujahideen, as these weary Afghanistans had not experienced any form of peace since 1979. Thousands of supporters flocked to join the Taliban, strongly optimistic at the sight of the Mujahideen forces that gave up and vanished into the mountains of Afghanistan. Well, that sounds familiar, right? Furthermore, Taliban support increased from the students of madrasas in Pakistan who crossed the border to join the Afghan brethren. The turning point for the Taliban occurred when Omar and his supporters finally mustered enough strength to capture Kabul in September 96. So there it is, right? The Taliban started out as nationalists. At least, sometimes these fascist movements or, people, bad groups of people, right? You can say that even from the beginning, they sort of say duplicitous things. Here, I don't think that's the case. Now, perhaps it doesn't need to be said that after this, the Taliban became as cruel a master of the Afghans as their American-backed Mujahideen before them. Mohammad Omar and his followers, unfortunately, did not learn from their predecessors, and they did become unrepentant killers of many under a quite arrogant, cruel, and existentially deviant form of Islam. But note that there is a thinking here to these people, a particular motivation for what they do. They are not simply mindless Islamic terrorists. If you think there's any content to this statement about, he was desired to act as a jihad against the people who harmed the Afghans. That simply is not, at least completely, Islamic, sort of generic, non-Muslim, hatred of non-Muslims, right? There is something in there, some legitimate way of thinking, right? A little piece of it that is there. They're not simply mindless Islamic terrorists, emphasis on the mindless, right? And you will not be able to deal with them effectively unless you know what their grievances are and what makes people join their cause. Consider this statement by Omar made in an interview with Muhammad Shahzad in 2004 while hiding from U.S. forces in the Pakistan border region. It concerns why he destroyed the famous Bamyan Buddha statue. He says, "I did not want to destroy the Bamyan Buddha. In fact, some foreigners came to me and said they would like to conduct the repair work of the Bamyan Buddha that had been slightly damaged due to rains. This shocked me. I thought these callous people have no regard for thousands of living human beings, the Afghans who are dying of hunger, but they are so concerned about non-living objects like the Buddha. This was extremely deplorable. This is why I ordered its destruction. Had they come for humanitarian work, I would never have ordered the Buddha's destruction." Now, once again, in some cases you might question, is this just, is the person being honest or whatever? But, this is quite a well-documented issue, or if you want to call it an issue, right? In fact, another good example is just look at Timothy McVeigh. and look at the kind of analysis at what motivated Timothy McVeigh to bomb that federal building, right? How there is some element of legitimate grievance, but because that individual, on the one hand, often doesn't have the sufficiently advanced moral reasoning, right? To kind of take that righteous anger maybe into a better direction, or because they simply they are in such desperate situation, right? Their oppression is so horrible that essentially, as Emil Durkheim says, right, they sought out their own destruction in that of others, right? A lot of the people, I think, of those 1,500 men, for them, it wasn't first killing people and then, suicide is the end. It's the other way around. It's suicide, but I'm really angry, right? And I need some sense that there's some agency in my life, right, that can be directed towards, quote, rectifying, right, the injustice against me. So, okay, but we see here once again, right, with respect to Omar, that there is an actual legitimate concern for a nationalist, the suffering of the Afghan people and the apparent disregard by Western nations. And I'm not saying like Omar's reasoning is really that good, right, but there are elements of it there. None of this means that how Omar acted based on that concern is morally justified from a secular viewpoint or a reasonable understanding of Islam. Upon reading the rest of the interview, I can clearly see he is not a man who understands the Prophet's message and instead worships a god of tribal violence. But there is a point he makes about the situation in Afghanistan that the Western powers did not admit. This is part of the reason why the U.S. mission in Afghanistan to, quote, set up democracy and root out terrorism failed. Western powers refused to recognize how they were often acting as indifferent warlords over the region, and that as a result, the Taliban had a useful recruiting tool, right? And I would say the main difference between how the United States behaved in Afghanistan and Iraq as opposed to Israel and Gaza is really, in the end, Israel is willing to completely be fine, right, with complete ethnic cleansing, right, complete expulsion of the Gazans, killing as many as possible as to basically get them out of there, and just keep the cycle going like that, right? That's the difference there, right? There is, I would say, in the minds of some of these desperate leaders, desperate portions of Israeli society that has just really refused to address the elephant in the room, they are willing to go that far. And yet, somehow, these are the civilized people, right? Those people, right? Specifically those people. The last major point Doron makes from about 1315 is a kind of clash of civilizations argument. Islamic terrorism in this, under this label, right? It is a fundamental threat to liberal democratic values like freedom of religion, gay and trans rights, women's rights. I agree. But note, right after this, he suddenly switches to talking about the rise of right-wing European governments as the example of the threat to liberal democracies. And I think, he does this precisely because, on the one hand, Doron correctly recognizes that right-wing fascism is a real threat in the West. But, the fact is, Islamic terrorism is not really a threat to democracies, right? At least on anywhere near the scale. So that can't be used as an example, right? And more importantly, Islamic terrorism and right-wing fascism are worlds apart. Right-wing fascism is in the West, right? Is in fact famously uses the generic threat of Islamic terrorism, making Muslims the scapegoats for the anger of its citizens to solidify its power and erode democracy. That's what happened in America after 9/11. And has become abundantly clear by now, the American government and its ruling elites used the trope of Islamic fundamentalism to justify other morally corrupt facts abroad and domestically that in the end did not ultimately remove the threat of terrorism, right? Other policies did. If we look today, like the fact that airplane security, in some ways, right, that is for show, but there were changes. And, to be honest, I do think my understanding it is the kind of just not letting the bad people get into the country in the first place. That is, the main thing. But if we look at Israel today, we can see some of this happening even before October 7th. political analysts agree that the country overall has become more and more right-wing over the decades. There is hyper-nationalism, i.e. Jewish supremacy. And note, yes, there is an influential political party in the Knesset now named Otzma Yehudit, right? Jewish power, which is explicitly anti-Arab and up until recently had a member, Itamar Ben-Gvir, as the national security member in the ruling cabinet. There is much more rapid annexation of the West Bank as Zionist zealots settled there with state support, specifically as a challenge to local Palestinian population. The business with the courts, right, we know all about that. Even it is also very apparent that most, but not all, right, of the Israelis marching in the street for, quote, liberal value of democracy, they were hostile to or unsupportive of a consistent application of this value to the Palestinian subjects under their power. So, I mean, again, like this, just this switch, right? Because really, if you know what Orientalism is, right, and understanding, yes, terrorism is real, right? Islamic terrorism, right? It's real, it's bad. It really just, if not more often than not, serves as a trope for other things going on. And the only way you kind of, for you yourself to fight it is by knowing the facts of the history, right? Knowing what it is that the people who are showing up saying, death to America, or whatever, why do they say that? Why do they really say that? If we look at how the Israeli government has responded after October 7th, the right-wing, authoritarian, and Jewish supremacist trend has accelerated. Many Israelis have no problem with their military committing war crimes and the killing of thousands of children, even as they understandably are angry about the killing of hundreds of their own. The support for the military, no matter what it does now, is very high. And the idea of actually discussing the real cause behind this violence, the brutal Israeli apartheid system, is increasingly being suppressed. Instead, the population's anger is being directed at other external enemies. The entire discourse by Israeli mainstream media and the United States, right, is basically about getting rid of this organization called Hamas. It gives the people the sense that the problems in their society are in a specific set of people that can be clearly marked and bombed, as they believe past problems could be dealt with. And there's an effort to make things about Iran, right? And by an effort, right? The leaders, right? The people who play the games here, right? And to get everyone behind a national front against a massive threat from outside, against which what the state does is only for self-defense. So I think in a way, that the juxtaposition in the last part of Doron's video is telling, and it's telling in another way, basically. The vague notion of Islamic terrorism, as opposed to an informed evaluation of it, is being cited as the cause for Israel's current problems, when in fact it is a trope that is being used by those in power to justify long-standing aims, right? The ones that have always been there. It is a woke excuse. It excuses further brutality and expansion into Gaza and the West Bank. It gives the current politicians a chance to enact perhaps their final ambitions in office before being voted out for their failure to manage Israel's security. It plays in with the U.S.'s desperate efforts to find an excuse to take action against Iran, even as other players like China are reconfiguring the power alliances in the region, and it finally allows Israelis to ignore once again the elephant in the room, the colonialist assumptions about Israel as embodied in the apartheid system. I think it's true that Israel overall does have liberal values within a certain portion of its population, right, the Jewish population, but those values need to be applied consistently to all the people under the power of the Israeli state for that appeal to them, right, to that value, to have any meaning. Similarly, criticizing the religious conservatism among many Palestinians on the ground that it oppresses gays, women, and such, that's fine, as long as that criticism is not being used in the service of violating even more fundamental values, like the general right of self-determination of an indigenous society. Now, if you want to learn more about what I just said, right, about like the way the rhetoric is being steered some way, and I don't know, like, if what Doron said, if that's influenced by that, it does seem so, but anyway, if you want to learn more, I recommend watching some videos produced recently by independent journalists Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate, the son of Gabor Mate, who has a lot to say actually about how violent conflicts become endemic, and how what's so wrong about how Israelis think about the other, right? So those two journalists talk about how officials in the Biden administration and the Netanyahu administration are purposely making statements couched in the language of Islamic terrorism and clash of civilizations to steer the narrative about what happened in Gaza. The last few things I will say here are in regard to the last string of ideas that Doron mentions at the end of the video. He says on the one hand that liberals need to stand up and defend liberal values, right? That is against Islamic terrorism. He says we need to not be intimidated by political correctness and to speak out against Islamic terrorism more often and to not mindlessly accuse Israel of genocide, right? He means, I guess he would think of people like me, right? By genocide in Gaza or colonialism in general, and to ultimately learn the facts about what has and is going on in that region. Well, certainly I agree with the last point. But if you followed me this far into my response video, I hope you agree that most of Doron's video simply does not heed this message. The people calling the massive killing of Gazans a genocide or war crime, right? The groups, the people who do that, such as the International Red Cross, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, various UN observers, Doctors Without Borders, B'Tselem, right? Various independent journalists, and researchers, like Norman Finkelstein, right, with a deep familiarity with the history and politics of the region, are pretty trustworthy in their evaluation of these kinds of things. That is, when you've got awful, unjustified violence. On the whole, they don't play favorites among nations, ethnicities, and religious groups. If they seem to be tough on a country, it's because that country has a problem, right? Like North Korea, China, right? America, they're fine with calling out war crimes in Muslim countries, the Far East, America, Russia, Africa, and Israel. And they're not perfect, but anyway, the people on the ground making these evaluations, right? The people on the ground making these evaluations about ethnic cleansing are deeply caring people for the suffering of the vulnerable and defenseless. If there is any group that they are partial towards, it is those that Chris Hedges calls the unworthy victims, right? The ones that the powerful just regard as, not worthy of helping, right? That they deserve it. These people work in places where most Israelis, Americans, or Europeans have barely experienced, and they're not doing it for money, fame, or particular national or ethnic agendas. So I would think it rather ridiculous to regard these people's analysis, especially in favor of spin doctors from the IDF or the White House, on the claims that they themselves are ignorant of the background conditions to the violence, or that they are anti-Semitic. Please make a real argument. Do not, unlike the man known as the official Israeli apartheid spokesman of Hebron, Ishai Fleischer, whom I had the rather unpleasant experience of sort of talking to and hearing him summarily dismiss the apartheid claims by Amnesty International on the grounds that they, quote, took jihadi money, right? Do not simply run away into the bubble that allows you to sleep at night amid all of the misery caused in your name. Here, I guess I'm talking about, right, the Israelis, but also secondarily Americans, right? As Cornel West has said, we do not need more milquetoast liberals in the fight for democracy, right? Because Doron's point is about fighting for democracy, and I support that, right? But we don't need more milquetoast liberals or woke hypocrites. The last image that Doron shows you of Harvard University students calling out Israel's illegal occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and the ongoing massacre there, right, is in fact a better example of the kinds of people Doron is calling to take action. Informed liberals who actually have accurate knowledge of the relevant society, right, or their own society, and others, and who stand up for justice and compassion in light of that awareness. Those students were subject to harassment and were doxxed by cowardly individuals who could come, they could come up with no argument to defend their beliefs. They could only react in retributive rage against the people making that clear. If it isn't already clear, right, the narrative defining the reality of Israel's colonial history and Israel's criminal actions, it continues to exist because it is championed by the powerful people of this world, or at least some subset, right? I mean, in the West, it's championed, right? There's China and such. People who are acting unjustly in all sorts of ways. The neoliberals in America, who continue to disregard the economic plight of most of their population and who hide behind woke symbolism, the corporate fascists, who constantly need some scapegoat to distract their desperate, uninformed followers, from why these officials, right, do not deserve their support. The managers of the American empire who still think they can dominate the Middle East through the Iron Triangle, U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia, corporate lobbyists, right? Executives, high-level university administrators who fear calling out the truth will lead to a withdrawal of billionaires' donations or of other, rich sponsors, and that includes UC Berkeley, right? Those people, and even, I think to some extent, even my own department. This should be a pretty good clue of who to take more seriously. In the West, it is largely the people who are marching in the street in opposition to the massacre in Gaza and Israeli apartheid in general. Precious Jews, Muslim, Christians, secular people, all sorts, as well as those politicians who have already shown, those few, right, who have already shown that they are not lackeys of the old neoliberal elites. So while there are certainly multiple narratives about Palestinian Israeli history, some are more anchored in facts than others. And I hope, on the basis of what I have said here, that you will be encouraged to further pursue the references I have provided to books and videos, which will give you much more of them, much more facts. So I welcome constructive, thoughtful comments on what I've said here.